All right, folks. Whew. Good evening, afternoon, night, whatever y'all want to call it. Welcome back to another fun-filled day of your North Carolina broker pre-licensing class. Whoop, whoop. I hope you are all doing lovely. Got a couple of folks still working their way in as per usual. I'm sure we'll have several of them. I think we're just missing one or two more coming in just a moment. Sam, good to see you. I got your message. I'm sorry I didn't get a chance to respond, but you made it, so that's good. Hey, how are you doing out there? Everybody alive? Everybody okay? Living their best life? Just excited to be here? Just having a blast and a half? All that?
You have too much energy for a Monday.
You know, I've got to with my job, right, Jacob? Like if I came in and I was just like, all right, let's just talk about some freaking licensing crap. Like all of y'all would just automatically be in a bad mood. So I got to be like super duper energetic and happy about everything we're about to go into to help y'all out. So hopefully it'll rub off on y'all a little bit. Sinus headache, Stephanie. I'm sorry to hear that. I had an ongoing headache like all weekend long, and so I'm finally feeling a little bit better today. Got a couple projects knocked out, so I'm sorry to hear that. Did y'all watch the Super Bowl?
Don't get me started.
Jacob, I didn't think you were watching it because you're sending me messages at 6:30 in that group me thing. I'm like, is this man know that it's Super Bowl Sunday?
I was studying while I was watching the Super Bowl.
I hear you. I'm like, man, I was just, yeah, that was, I mean, it was a good game, but, it was disappointing if you're a 49ers fan. But what can you do?
I'm just simply not a Taylor Swift fan.
Well, I'll be honest with you. I've been seeing a lot of stuff like going around on like the back and forth. And so, I think we can all agree that, the fact that Taylor Swift is like the talk of the Super Bowl is a problem. But at the end of the day, she's just a little girl that does her thing. She's out there, cheering on her man. As much as we don't like it, just let her live her truth, I reckon, Because listen, if she wasn't there, we'd all be hating on her like, well, she's a terrible girlfriend, right? So, poor celebrities, damned if you do, damned if you don't, as they say. Pardon my French. So, but I agree. It's, just hearing all about it with her stuff nonstop, as they say. Tell you what, let me hit record here so we get anything useful.
Recording in progress.
So, before I kick off with a little bit of a reminder of things that we've previously talked about, and I'll actually go ahead and share my screen to put up some of the previous stuff where we're going to pick up today. But as per usual, I will open the floor to maybe anything that you've seen, you're unsure about, you want me to talk about, answer for you. Let me know.
I don't have a question on that, but I do have a question, and I think a couple of other people in class have it.
Okay.
For the midterm, can we go ahead and work on it, or is that something we need to do with you? I just want to make sure it's okay to go ahead and do it.
Excellent question. You are okay to do it. I wouldn't do it quite yet because you don't know quite everything that's going to be on it, but you are allowed to take it as many times as you want. So if you would like to go ahead and tackle it, you do you. Just remember, in order to, Justin, I just caught that. In order for it to count as completed, I believe it has to be an 80 or better on it. So yeah, if you want to go ahead and tackle it and you get like a 20, don't don't be discouraged because we haven't taught you all the concepts yet, but you sure can.
And it's timed at 2 hours, so if you don't finish it in 2 hours, it's going to score you, and then you have to start over, right?
So the one thing I'll tell you is that I'm actually pretty nice to y'all. You can save your progress and log back in. So let's say that you're starting and you got to go pick up your kid from soccer practice, and you're like, oh my God, I don't have time to do it, and I just wasted an hour. And nope, you can save your progress and log out. You just have to create a password, and you can log back in, and your time will remember, and it'll pick up. So you can do that.
Okay.
Yep.
Thank you.
For sure. Good question. Any other questions about any of the fun-filled things out there?
So, what is the difference between Pro V and just regular property taxes?
Hold on. Did you say per Ultra V? So let me help you out with a couple of things here. Don't confuse. I mean, there's a lot of concepts that sound very similar. Per Ultra V is a type of a life estate. A life estate per Ultra V for the life of another. But then...
That's not the one that I meant.
Okay, that's what I figured.
I forgot the name of the other one.
Okay, let's talk about it because I'm assuming that you mean ad valorem versus real property versus excise. Maybe that's where some confusion lies. Yeah, okay. Let's talk about it. Ad valorem tax and real property tax are the exact same thing. Ad valorem is just a fancy roundabout way of saying assessed value. So if I say real property tax or ad valorem tax, same thing.
I'm sorry, can you say that all over one more time? I tried to take off my sweatshirt and my AirPods.
No worries. Yeah. If we say ad valorem tax or real property tax, that's the exact same thing. Ad valorem is just kind of like one of those, Latin-y, jargony terms that just means assessed value. And so if I was to say your ad valorem tax on real estate or your real property tax on real estate, I'm talking about the exact same thing. Now, do understand that, and I'm going to add another note to that, and then if I haven't answered it, ask. If I was to say, well, in North Carolina, when we say like an assessed value, we're typically taxing you on 100% of that assessed value. But remember, in other states, they could have what's called that equalization factor, where maybe like 50% of the market value or some other kind of value that they are taxing you on. But then there's also excise tax, which we're going to talk about today, which is something completely different. So let me know. Is there a deeper dive you need me to go on any of those?
I was just confused because in the textbook, I was reading through it, and the textbook specifically says not to be confused with property tax.
It's probably saying that about excise tax, depending on when you're reading, because ad valorem tax is, all ad valorem means is assessed value tax. Now, in theory, Jacob, be careful what you're reading. You could have ad valorem tax on personal property. When you pay your car taxes, that's based on the value that the tax assessor thinks your personal property is worth. But because we're not hardly ever talking about taxes on personal property, if it's real property ad valorem tax and real property tax, those are the same things. But in theory, we do call it ad valorem for personal property as well. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that makes sense, but it was just confusing because that's not, the textbooks, I might have just been confused by the way that it worded it, but it made it seem like they were different things, and I couldn't figure out what the difference was.
Gotcha.
So I was getting really frustrated with that.
Yeah, and if you ever find a specific page where it says something stupid, I'll send it to the publisher, but take a look at it later, and if I'll look at it too later tonight and see if I can find anything that's contradictory, but they're the same. Anything else y'all want to talk about before we get into this fun-filled night?
I do also have one more thing, but I'm trying to find it, so
go ahead.
No moment.
Yeah, no worries. I'm going to give everybody a second to think about it while they have a moment.
Okay, a levy and a lien. Can you go over? A lien. I thought I knew what it was, and then it almost seemed like in the textbook, like they were using levy and lien interchangeably. So if you could clarify those as well too, I'd appreciate that.
I'm happy to clarify those. However, I would probably. It would probably do you a little bit more service if we just hold off on that one. And the reason being, liens are definitely part of the encumbrance section. but liens have a much more in-depth discussion in the financing section. So to fully understand it, we need to get to the financing section. So I would say, you know, maybe let's just wait on that one, because now, I mean, if there's anything that's like super taxing from a testable point of view that's throwing you off, I'll clarify it. But I just think that when I actually get to the financing section and start talking about liens a little more in depth about how they work, what they are, and all that, it's just gonna like flip a switch in your brain. Yeah.
Could you quickly go over levy then?
Yeah, what was the context of levy? I just want to make sure that I'm telling you correctly, because there's a couple definitions of levy.
Well, then that could explain why I'm having a hard time. No, I like kind of thought that I knew what it meant, but like as I was reading it, it kept saying levy in the textbook, and I wanted to make sure that I knew what it meant so that I knew that I was understanding the concepts.
So here's the only reason why, you know, and I doubt, I'm sure you're reading it in the exact same chapter. A levy is an area that stores water, geographically speaking, but if we're talking about it from a financial point of view, a levy is actually seizing your property to satisfy a general lien. So like if you don't pay your IRS property taxes and the IRS wanted to file a general lien against you, Jacob, and say, we're going after your stuff, a levy would be the act of seizing your personal property to sell it to get their money. A lien is attached to, you know, a person or a property, and it's the right to go after them for the debt. The levy is actually seizing property for the debt. A lien is attached to a person that's the right to go after the debt or after the person's assets.
Thank you so much.
Okay, good deal.
That's the exact clarification that I needed.
Okay.
Makes sense, because I was really confused.
Good deal. And I sometimes I just have to make sure I understand the context of what, because, you know, there are some weird arbitrary terms like that, and I just wanted to make sure it wasn't the anything dealing with water rights or anything like that, the actual levy, like the dam kind of thing. So yeah, that's the only difference. And once again, when we get into the financing, we're going to talk about liens a little bit more, because remember, there's general liens, which is attaching to a person, right? Going after all of Jacob's assets. Then there's specific liens, which attaches to a specific piece of real property. And either way, liens are just the right to go after a person or a person's assets or the specific asset. The levy is the act of seizing real property to satisfy a debt from a lien. No. Any others that I can hit on real quick before we move forward? Good deal. Just a reminder, folks, I got to see your bright, shiny, smiley faces on camera. Got a couple of cameras not on at this point. So if you would remedy that post haste so I don't have to cry to chop you out of this meeting and you can get credit for being here. So let me remind you what we kind of got into last week, okay? Last week, we started talking about legal descriptions, and there are several different types of legal descriptions. Folks, why are legal descriptions important?
To make sure you're upholding the law and you're not doing anything to get yourself in trouble.
Well, so not so much anything with the law, but when I say legal description, what is a legal description?
It's a description of a property.
It is a description of a property.
Legal description of a property.
It is a legal description of the property, and what's the use of it?
It helps a survey find the property, a surveyor find the property.
There you go.
For documentation.
For legal purposes, right? It would not be enough for a sales contract or a deed transference or anything like that to just say 123 Main Street. That's too informal, because there could be more than one. And so a legal description is important because it allows us to have no question about which property is the subject matter of a legal document, whether that be a contract or a deed. So we talked about legal descriptions in that regard. And what were the different types of legal descriptions we talked about?
Meets and bounds.
Meets and bounds. And what did you need to know about meets and bounds?
You needed to know about the monuments,
Monuments.
the directions.
Yep, meets and bounds, right? Meets is how far, bounds is directions, and it utilizes what we call calls to tell you where to go next. And so that typically goes to those identifiable points called monuments. What do we call the place that you start off with the meets and bounds description?
The point of beginning.
Point of beginning. And then when we're giving you this meets and bounds legal description, where should it end?
At the point of beginning.
Back at that point of beginning. You would also potentially need to know the use of the word minutes and degrees. Sometimes they utilize those in those directions as well. It is utilized in the original 13 colonies, which North Carolina is one of. And that's really what you need to know about it, okay? Nothing too crazy, nothing too in-depth. You're not going to have to read one, but you need to know those. What was another one of those legal descriptions we had?
Government and rectangular survey.
There you go. Government survey system, also called rectangular survey system, also called the government rectangular survey system. And didn't y'all just love that one? Tell me about that one. Don't love it. Not fun. Pass. But from a testable point of view, what do you need to know?
Mainly used west of the Mississippi River.
West of the Mississippi. That is true.
Y'all don't laugh at me.
Mississippi.
I didn't get that one. I'll be honest. I didn't get it at all.
So,
The one that you have to know the north, south, northeast, south, and west, and it's got the little blocks.
yeah. It is based on principal meridians and baselines, which form a grid pattern out in the areas where these are established. And they're used as reference points to give legal descriptions. And so we always refer to them as, what? Say again?
6 miles squared.
What is 6 miles squared?
Each, I think it's a plot.
Mm-mm.
A section?
Mm-mm.
Section.
Mm-mm.
The township?
The township is the larger piece, and that is 6 miles squared. And what is within the township?
36 sections.
Try saying that 3 times fast, huh, Samantha? 36 sections. Yeah, it's 36 sections within the township. And what's the section at the top right?
1.
1. What's the section at the top left?
6.
6. What's the section at the bottom right?
Bottom right.
36.
36. There you go. And so each one of those sections is how big?
1 by 1 mile.
1 square mile. 1 mile by 1 mile. That's exactly right. And how many acres are in a section?
640.
640. And then remember with those legal descriptions, it is the smallest to the largest. So we have these little bits within that section. And so it would be something like the northwest 1/4 of the southwest 1/4 of the northwest 1/4 of section 32 of township 6 north range 5 east. That's the way that legal description works. Starts smallest to largest. And every single one of you wanted to throw up in your mouths whenever I started to teach it. I told you in North Carolina, we no longer have any math on it, but just be aware of those different pieces just in case. And so that is the government rectangular survey system. What was the other method that we talked about? The other main one that we really talked about for legal description?
The deed and plot maps or lot and block.
Yeah, there you go. Now, technically, they're 2 different ones, but very similar concepts, okay? There is reference to a recorded plat, also called the lot and block method, which is where a surveyor would go out and they would draw these maps and they would take this map and put it in the public record. So then you could reference that, lot 6 of phase 5 of Rolling Willows subdivision, and then it would be referenced in, Book of Maps 2004, page 192. And so when you look at that image in the public record, you knew exactly which property we're talking about. Similar concept, but not the same method, is reference to a recorded plat. And the reason why that is suitable is because when you look at that, reference to a recorded deed, I apologize. Reference to a recorded deed works similarly because when you look at that deed, we left off talking about this, a deed has to have an adequate legal description. So if you reference a deed and you go look at that deed, it would contain one of these other methods, right? The lot and block method, the government survey system, or the meets and bounds method. So in other words, another legally applicable description that was allowable. So then we moved from these descriptions. We talked about the Machinery Act. We talked about taxes. You know, we did some math and some calculations, and we left off talking about transfer of title, okay? Transfer of title to real property. Now, I switched the slides around a little bit because I wanted you to see a couple of things. When we're dealing with transfer of title, first and foremost, well, folks, what is a deed? What's a deed?
It's a document that shows conveyance of ownership.
Yeah, it is the document that showed that a transfer of title happened. Remember, it's such a weird thing. Title is a concept of ownership, right? You are said to be the owner when you have this title to real property, but there is no such thing as a title for real property. There is a title for your car, but title is a concept of ownership. Misty, we're in Unit 4 technically still at this point because that is the transfer of title. Actually, I want to show y'all something real quick before I really dive deeper into this. Let me pull this up. I'm going to share something with you because I think this is important for you to see. Right here is the syllabus that I gave you at the start of class. And so Unit 4, transfer of title to real property. And so we've kind of had a lot of discussions within here. But of course, one of the things that I added into the mix on the first couple nights was some North Carolina license laws and commission rules, which is why, you know, the timing's a little off. Don't worry about that. We're going to make it up elsewhere. So we're here in this transfer to title section. We're going to knock out land use controls tonight. And then we start getting into these doozy sections. Now, these numbers in this syllabus are how long we should spend talking to each one. It's just a guide, though. It's not a perfect science because there's some that it wants us to spend way longer than we even remotely need to. Now, I do want to remind you that, as I told you on day one, yeah, we're in this very unique time where the testing things will be changing. So I shared with you the updated draft of the real estate licensing in North Carolina book. And so it's also in the group me. Manoj helped me and shared it in there. And I do have the draft of the new syllabus. Now, I will share this with you, but my recommendation would be focus on the old one. And I can't stress that enough because this one is very intimidating. Number one, because it's a draft. Number two, there's a lot of duplicates on here. Basically what they did is they took the syllabus and they have restructured it into the testable categories. The way that they are moving into this new test, there are 8 testable categories for each section. And let me just show you this if you haven't looked in the relink book really quick. So notice how these all say draft. It could change, but if you go and you look at the way that this compared to the one I showed you on day one, and you look at the testable categories, there are 8 on each section. Right here. National categories, 8. State categories, 8. Nothing was taken away. They just regrouped the categorization of testing, which is why I'm telling you, do not let this different syllabus freak you out. Do not get so concerned with it. It's all the same information that's in this syllabus. They have just moved it around. I'm still going to be teaching you the flow as it is here. But if you are curious about the way that they're breaking down the testable categories, I'm happy to share this new syllabus with you. So I just wanted everybody to be on the same page. Nobody panic. It's all the same. Okay? Nothing weird. Same class. Everybody cool. Remind me at the end of class, and I'll share this other syllabus with you. I don't want you to be so caught up on it right now while I'm teaching you these important topics, but at the end of class, I will share this new syllabus with you so you can have it. There you go. So let's get back to where we were. We are going to wrap up 4 today, 5 today, 6 today, and then we'll get into the agency stuff tomorrow, and that's where the fun really begins. So in the transfer to title section, we talked about title being a concept. It is not a document when we're dealing with real property, and so to have title is this thought of you owning this bundle of legal rights that we talked about under basic real estate concepts, you know, that deep sea right of disposition, exclusion, enjoyment, possession, and control in dealing with this real property. And then when you convey it to somebody else, they would potentially have all those rights or whatever other rights you transferred to them. And we told you that with title, when you remove yourself from an ownership or from this title, it's called alienation. And so we said there are 2 different types of alienation last week. There is voluntary alienation, meaning you choose to remove yourself from the ownership. And then there is involuntary alienation. Involuntary alienation, as the name sounds, is where you do not elect to remove yourself from the ownership. You are removed against your will. That is involuntary alienation. And so we talked about some of these. Okay, voluntary alienation is gift, sell, will, I told you, is kind of an interesting one. When you will it to somebody, it's neither really voluntary or involuntary. You choose the person, but you don't necessarily choose your time of death. So I kind of like to keep that separate. But otherwise, voluntary is the normal ways that you would think about it. And then we got into, remember, the involuntaries. That's the death one. But when we got into involuntaries, I moved the slide so they were all grouped together because I had accidentally moved them too far. So we talked about specific lien foreclosure. Remember, as I was just telling Jacob earlier, a lien is the right of somebody you owe money to go and attach something to, a specific lien to a piece of real property. So when you borrow money to buy a house, you would put a voluntary lien on your property, but that lien, if you don't pay them, would represent the right for them to involuntarily alienate you from your property. They have the right to sell it out from under you to get their money. So that specific lien foreclosure would be an involuntary alienation. You didn't pay, so they sold it. I do want to say this because a lot of people get confused about what a foreclosure is, and they think the bank is taking it. And I think I mentioned this last week. A foreclosure is not the bank taking your property. They don't want it. It is, think of it this way, a forced closure. Foreclosure. They sell it at an auction to somebody else and then kick you out and take the money. So a specific lien foreclosure would be an involuntary alienation. We talked about adverse possession. Now remember, what was the thing that I warned you to not confuse adverse possession with? I'll give you a hint. It has the exact same criteria.
Is it easement by prescription?
That's exactly what it is, Sam. Thank you. Do not confuse an easement by prescription with adverse possession. What is the huge difference there?
One of them you're just using, the other one you actually own.
Which is which?
So adverse possession is ownership, And the other one is just you're using it.
There you go. An easement is the right to use somebody else's property. So an easement by prescription would say, no, 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 I met these criteria. I should get to continue using it. Adverse possession says, no, 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 I met these criteria. I should get to steal it. I should get to own it. That's the difference, but the criteria is the exact same. It is the OCEAN acronym for both. Some materials will refer to it as high ocean. It's really unnecessary to add that HI because it's all encompassed in this this ocean. Open meaning not hidden. Continuous meaning haven't stopped doing it. Exclusive means you're the only one doing it. Adverse from the ownership. You don't own it. You know you don't own it, but you're doing it anyway. And then notorious means you don't have permission. And then the length of time in North Carolina, although it varies in some states, but in North Carolina, it's 20 years. Unless you have what we call color of title, meaning some type of title defect or suggestion that you may have an ownership interest. And I gave you the example last year, you know, back in the beginning of January, I could have said that, but this is last week. I gave you the example last week of the property I own in Georgia and having that color of title on that 5-acre parcel. And I could have stolen it at 7 years, but I didn't. So then the other two that I moved the slides up on, just so they're all in the same pretty place on the slides, and I'm happy to share these, you know, slightly tweaked slides. Of course, as I mentioned with the test changing, I've been moving stuff around in these, and so I don't want you to ever miss out on anything. This is just a supplemental note on adverse possession. Please understand that'll never happen automatically. You would have to go to court to steal the property to claim that ownership. Okay, it's not just like magical that, oh, I met these criteria, now I own it. No, you got to go to court and prove those criteria. That's kind of the key point there. And then the other two that we mentioned last week, but you didn't have the slides for involuntary alienation was escheat. Folks, what was escheat? Who remembers?
We use the Dorothea Dix where somebody dies and they don't have a will, so the government comes in, well, they go down the line and do who it's supposed to be dispersed to, and then if they don't have anybody, the government comes in and takes your property.
There you go. If you die without a will, that is called dying what?
Without a will?
Yeah, without a will. What's the technical terminology for dying without a will?
Instate.
Intestate. Intestate. And if you die with a will, it's called what? Testate. There you go. So when you die without a will, there are a lot of states that have what we call the law of intestate succession, North Carolina being one of them, where they basically, the state will write a will for you. And they try to give it to this person, if that person doesn't exist, and it's that person, and so on and so forth, about 6 or 7 people. And if you don't have anybody on that list of their go-tos, they will cheat you out of it, is how a lot of people like to think about it. Even though you didn't have anybody, it's kind of not on you. So if you die without a will and there's nobody to give it to, the state will take it. It's called escheat. What do they do with it? They typically sell it at auction, and it's supposed to go to public schools, funding, and things of that nature. I don't know if that's true or not. That's just what I've been told, what I've read. That won't be on your test, so it's okay. And then the last one is eminent domain. And I gave you a story to wrap up the night. Eminent domain is the right of the government to take your property for the greater good. To build highways, to build parks, to build schools, to build libraries, whatever they deem necessary for the greater good. Understand that the right to take it is called eminent domain. The act of taking is called condemnation. Okay, the actual process is called condemnation. You do need to differentiate those, and it's extremely testable. They cannot just take it for free. They have to give you just and fair compensation. And then I told you some states you could contest their ability to take it in court. North Carolina is what we call a right to take state. You cannot contest it. If the government in North Carolina says we're taking it, they are taking it. The only thing you could potentially do is go to court to try to get them to pay you more. Now, I'll make this one last note here, and of course I'm going to expand on this later. Taking of lease property terminates the lease. Well, the reason why that's in there is because when we get into basic contract law and contracts in general, we're going to have some very in-depth discussions on what could terminate a contract. Well, folks, a lease is a type of contract, and a residential lease survives a lot. But the government says, oh, no, 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 we're the government, so we can terminate leases when we want to. So if they take a property that is subject to a lease, the lease would die. Now, a lot of times they are obligated to pay for, some type of moving expenses for the lessee, as well as purchasing the property, but it does terminate the lease. So just a supplemental note on eminent domain, just, to see it again. Federal, state, local governments, they all have the authority to do this. Doesn't really change anything. And I told you the process is called condemnation, and it's the use of what we call a police power. We're going to get into police powers a little bit more today. It's the difference between what we call private and public land use controls. Public is, adhering to certain things for the betterment of a community. Private is very local and neighborhood or individual law owners, private ownership dealings versus public. We're going to talk about that in just a moment. So this is where we threw back in the, list of ors and es that you need to know, and we're going to talk more about them. Now, here's where we actually left off. Now, folks, I went ahead and I changed this back up, and I want you to note this because I didn't want to confuse you last week because, Misty brought up a good point. Folks, there are certain things that are very, very much required for a deed to be valid. And I gave you that list last week, but the one that I left out temporarily because I didn't want you to screw you up on the abstract nature of it was consideration, okay? Here is the full list of things that need to be valid. The reason why consideration, you got to be very careful with, it does not have to be money. There does have to be something of value, but it is enough to just state there is something of value, because it is not required for you to state the amount of consideration. You're going to see that in just a second. So a deed, in order to be valid, has to be in writing, has to have the legal capacity of the grantor only, 18, sane and sober. The grantor and the grantee have to be identified. It has to have those adequate words of conveyance. I showed you that on the deed last week. Does hereby grant, convey, bargain, and exchange, yada, yada, yada. Has to have something of value, but as long as we state there's something, it's legally enforceable. So could be love and affection, could be, yeah, there's money, mind your business. As long as it states there's something of value, then it's noted to have consideration. Has to contain an accurate legal description of the property. Signed by the grantor only. And then has to be delivered and voluntarily accepted. Now, this is where I told you, you're going to be very careful with test questions in regard to this. Because if they give you a scenario and all of these things are present, and the question is, has ownership transferred? The answer is yes. Just because the rest of the world doesn't know about it doesn't change anything. I used that example last week where you don't remember who I used, but I said, I drafted this up, I stated it had consideration, I had, all these different things present, and then I handed it to them. Did they own my property? Yeah. But nobody knows it but me, and that's why we record it. You record to make this title transfer enforceable against third-party claims. Because if there's a deed right now that says I own it, but then I transferred it to somebody else and they don't record it, it still looks like in the public record I own it. Which is the whole reason why I said you are presumed to be the owner when you are named as the grantee on a deed, but it's not a guarantee. There are other people who may have claims to this property out there for any number of reasons. Now, unfortunately, this list is just very cumbersome and it's a lot to remember. And so I told you there is an acronym to help you remember this. I don't love it because it doesn't hit on everything and it can be confusing. So I will show it to you, but it's entirely up to you how you want to remember this. The acronym, the mnemonic, the whatever you want to call it, I guess it's more of a mnemonic than an acronym in this case, The mnemonic is, I get paid with every deal. And so I is in writing. Get, saying that you have to have the legal capacity as the grantor. Now, of course, it also has to be signed by the grantor, but that's outlined in a different section. P is the property, right? Paid property, legal description of the property. With is adequate words of conveyance. E is execution for the every. And then deal is delivered and accepted. So yet again, this acronym leaves out consideration, which is a problem because there does have to be some form of consideration. I don't love this mnemonic. I don't find it overly helpful, but if you do, you, boo-boo. So I get paid with every deal. So here's where I'm going to introduce a very, very, very testable concept, okay? There is something called the Statute of Frauds, and it is extremely testable. Now understand that every single state, more or less, has their own Statute of Frauds. So while the Statute of Frauds is not a North Carolina specific concept, you're really going to be tested more on the specifics of the North Carolina Statute of Frauds. But from a national point of view, most states require what I'm about to tell you. So just be careful. So the Statute of Frauds is a law, okay? It is a statute, a piece of legislation that was passed that basically stated there are certain things that are not enforceable in a court of law unless they are in writing. Let's say that again. There are certain things that are not enforceable in a court of law unless they are in writing. The reason why we're bringing this up now is because deeds is one of those things. What I mean is, let's say that I went up to Corey and I said, Corey, but hey, listen, I want you to have my house at 123 Main Street. And we shake hands. That's not enough to convey real property. A deed showing the transfer of title is required to be in writing, as we just said. So if Corey shows up to live in that house and I said, oh, no, Corey, I changed my mind, Corey could not go to court and claim ownership on just that verbal exchange. So there are certain things that if they are not in writing, you cannot take them into a court of law. They will not hear them. They will say, do not waste our time. And for good reason, folks. Imagine if they heard every Joe Schmo who's claimed that they own somebody's house. The legal systems would be so tied up, you understand? So when we're dealing with very sensitive documents that deal with things like the transfer of real property, we basically say, because of the likelihood of fraudulent activity with these things, these need to be in writing or we will not hear them in court. This is extremely testable. So there are several things that you need to make sure that you understand are on the Statute of Frauds. Deeds is one of them. Contracts for the sale of real property. Very specifically, real property. Contracts for the sale of a car, not necessarily. Is it a good idea to always have everything in writing? Yes. Restrictive covenants. Promissory notes. And leases in excess of 3 years. I'm going to say that again. Leases in excess of 3 years, meaning if it's 2 years and 360 days, it's not legally required to be in writing for it to be enforceable in a court of law. This is where people get so caught up. If I wanted to sell a property to Adriana and we wanted to write up a contract, it would have to be in writing because it deals with real property. So contracts for the sale of real property. And so what that means is, yet again, if Adriana and I had a verbal agreement and wasn't in writing, and then I refused to sell it to her, she goes to court and she says, I'd like to take Seth to court because he backed out of this contract. They're going to say, sucks to suck, lady. Should have gotten it in writing. It's not enforceable in a court of law because it wasn't in writing. But let me give you some clarity on this leases thing, folks. If you have a contract, or, well, a lease is a type of a contract. If you have a lease for 1 year, does that have to be in writing in North Carolina to be enforceable in a court of law?
No.
No. You would be stupid to not have it in writing as a landlord or a tenant. It would be a much harder case to hear in a court of law, but they will hear it. So if you get a question that says, Seth has a 1 year agreement with DeJay to, rent his beach house at $1,500 a month, it wasn't required to be in writing under the statute of frauds. No. So if I do something I'm not supposed to, or DeJay does something, doesn't matter. We can still go to court because it wasn't in writing. Doesn't matter. It wasn't required to be in writing. So I'm going to say it again. Deeds, restrictive covenants, promissory notes, contracts for the sale of real property, and leases in excess of 3 years. These are your most testable items on the statute of frauds. So we're going to talk about this statute of frauds multiple times throughout this course. This is just a real big introduction to it. Now I'm going to go ahead and introduce the sister legal concept to this. There is another legal concept called the Connor Act. The Connor Act. Now folks, the list of things on the statute of frauds and the list of things on the Connor Act are basically identical. But here's the big difference. The statute of frauds says certain things need to be in writing to be enforceable in a court of law. In other words, to have a court hearing on this document. The Connor Act says these same documents should be recorded to protect against third-party interest, or in other words, to be enforceable against third-party claims. So we don't have to record a deed for it to be valid. But if you wanted to protect your interest against somebody else trying to come and claim that they own it, you would record it to make it enforceable against third-party claims. Because recordation in the Register of Deeds is considered public notice. It is you announcing to the public, this thing happened. Well, for a deed, this thing is transfer of ownership. I was named the new grantee by way of transfer of title, and I have this deed to evidence it. So you have let the public know that you are presumably currently the owner of record. Now we're going to talk more.
So 3 years of leases for this one.
Absolutely. Yep. Absolutely. Now I want to point out something because Jacob just asked a good question. Is it still 3 years or more for leases with this? Yeah. Now here's the weird thing, folks. I told you the list is basically the same. The things that should be recorded to protect against third-party interest: covenants, deeds, contracts for the sale of real property, leases in excess of 3 years. But ironically enough, we do not typically record sales contracts. Are they named in North Carolina on the Connor Act? Yeah. But we don't record them. Why do you think that is? We always have contracts for the sale of real property in writing, but we don't actually record them typically. Why?
I'm going to make a guess, and I'm going to say that we don't record them because it's a finished transaction and it's a transaction for the deed to convey the title.
So you're saying we don't record the contract because ultimately it will end up with the deed that will convey the title, and that will be recorded. That's a pretty solid guess. Yeah. Let me give you a little insight into it, folks. If I was to get under contract with Justin, okay, to buy Justin's house, and it was in writing, and Justin changed his mind, said, nope, I'm out. Well, because it was in writing, what can I do to Justin?
Can you sue me?
There you go. I can take Justin to court. And for me, that's all I need to know. As long as I have a remedy, a way to, go after somebody if I don't get what I want, then I'm cool. All that recording a sales contract would do, it would be to tell the rest of the world that that property is under contract. But we don't really need to do that because if Justin gets under contract with multiple people, we can all sue him. We can all take him to court because it was in writing. Does that make sense? So it's kind of a moot point to record it. Recording would just let the rest of the world know that I was under contract to buy Justin's property. But I don't care if Justin screws himself over because I know that I can take him to court if he does me dirty. So statute of frauds deals with things needing to be in writing. The Connor Act deals with things being recorded to protect against third-party claims. Somebody trying to come in and get under contract or pretend they own it or, things of that nature. So here's where I'm going to introduce some more verbiage before we take a deeper dive into the last couple concepts in this section. And I told you when we started off on this section, you've got to be very, very careful, folks. There are a lot of concepts within this class that sound extremely similar. And deeds and contracts are two of those topics. Because as we're sitting here talking about the Connor Act and the statute of frauds, well, that's a very important conversation for deeds. That's a very important conversation for real estate contracts. And now I'm introducing these terms, valid, void, and voidable. And these terms are very much a big part of deeds and very much a big part of contracts. And so you always have to pay attention to what the question is asking. Because if we're talking about a deed and we're talking about a contract, we can all agree those are very different things. As y'all just pointed out, the deed is showing the transfer of title. That's where a contract typically leads up. The contract for the sale of real property is the precursor to that. So when we are talking about voidable, voidable is basically the right of one person to undo it, to back out. And so when we said that you had to have the legal capacity as a grantor for this deed, we said 18, sane and sober. Well, folks, are there times that you think that maybe somebody under 18 might own some real property? Yeah. Maybe they inherited it. Maybe it's 12-year-old Justin Bieber, okay? These celebrities out there with millions of dollars at 12. And so they have the right to convey real property. But understand that they could go back on it. That's what voidable means. So if I was to go and buy, a 13-year-old piece of property that they inherited without anything to the contrary, basically they would have the right to come back and say, no, I didn't mean to do that. And they could get their ownership back for that property because they don't have the legal capacity to convey. Now, of course, if they turn 18 and they still don't go back on it, they probably invalidated that time. The longer they go, once they become a legal adult without, trying to go back on it, they probably no longer have the right to go back on it. So timing does matter with these things. But somebody who is a minor conveying real property could make it voidable. They could potentially get the ownership back. If you were drunk as a skunk, high as a kite, that would potentially make it voidable as well. Imagine in the scenario where I gave last week where I was talking about signing up a deed and transferring ownership to somebody. What if I did it at the bar one night? Tim and I were taking shots. And on a napkin, I drafted up everything that we said was required of a deed, and I transferred it over to Tim, and I was 3 sheets to the wind. Well, folks, there's a good chance I didn't mean to do that, right? I was just wasted. And so if I could go to the court of law, either if Tim doesn't say, okay, yep, nope, it's fine, and let me out of it, I could go to court and I could prove that I was under the influence and I could regain my ownership. It would be a voidable deed. Voidable is the right of one person to potentially back out. Now, void, and we're going to talk more about these terminologies in the contract section, way more. Void is no legal standing at all. The most common example of void is somebody who has been declared mentally incompetent. Now think back to, gosh, I don't even remember at this point. I think we introduced some of these terminologies before, or you know what it was? It was on day one when I was talking about a trustee, a guardian as being an exemption under North Carolina license law. And I talked about Britney Spears, and Jacob's like, well, can you tell us more about that? Folks, when Britney Spears was in her conservatorship, she had been declared mentally incompetent by a court of law, which means that she did not have the capacity to enter into any agreement on her own. And so if Britney Spears had signed her mansion over to you by way of a deed while she was in her conservatorship, it's considered void. No, she didn't. Doesn't matter that you have the document. Doesn't matter that Britney actually signed it. Doesn't matter that it had all the essential elements. Because Britney had her rights taken away from her, toss it out. That deed has no legal standing. It would be the same if you had a parent who had dementia and they were not of their own, faculties. Okay, so if you tried to convince your, parent with Alzheimer's or dementia to sign something over to you and you weren't their legal guardian, toss it out. You don't own it. It has no legal standing. That's what void means. Doesn't exist. Everybody with me? So I told you what a deed has to have. I told you a little bit of things in regard to deeds. Let me tell you what a deed does not have to have in order to be valid. Does not have to be witnessed. Nobody has to be around to see that exchange happen, to see that deed transference. Does not have to have a date on it. Does not have to state the amount of consideration. So here's where I want to circle back. It does have to have something of value, but we don't have to say what it is or how much. That's why I can just say something generic like, for valuable consideration, the receipt, if whatever, is hereby acknowledged. We just basically say, yeah, I got something to value, mind your business, and that's enough. Or we could say love and affection as a gift because I wanted to. So it doesn't have to be money. It does not have to be acknowledged. Folks, acknowledge is just a legal word for notarized. It does not have to be recorded. And it does not have to be signed under any seal or anything like that. Now, one side note, folks. In order to record something, it does have to be notarized. So, notarized would be required to record, but since neither of those is required for it to be valid, you see how this kind of flows. And this is why I told you, in theory, a deed that had everything that we said it had to have, this stuff's not needed. It's still valid. You just potentially can't record it unless you had some of these things. And so in the real world, the date is on it. It is notarized. It is recorded. Still doesn't state the amount of consideration. But the reason we do all that stuff is not because it lacks validity. It's because we want to protect our interest against third-party claims. Well, when I keep saying protect our interest against third-party claims, what do I mean? Help me understand that. What do I mean by protect our interest against third-party claims? Which third parties?
Anyone?
Anyone. But there's a very specific person that you may want to be concerned about.
The government?
Not the government.
The guarantor?
The grantor. The grantor. Folks, think about it. If Kingsley and I do a back alley deed transference, right? And I give Kingsley $300,000 and Kingsley signs over a deed to me and it contains all the essential elements, it's valid. But I keep telling you, if you were to go down to the public record and look up the current owner of record, who's it going to say if I never recorded mine? Kingsley. And so that means Kingsley could turn around and try to commit fraud, pretends he still owns it, and sell it to somebody else. So yes, mine and Kingsley's deed may be valid, but I would be stupid to not record it to protect my interest against other people claiming to own it or against Kingsley claiming to still own it. So be very careful from the difference of like, well, what's required for it to be valid versus what's the best practice? What do we do in a standard settlement of closing of real property? Because you will not do a single transaction in your entire real estate career that is not notarized, not recorded, not dated. All of those things will happen every time. But be very careful with what the question's asking. They're not required for it to be valid. Everybody okay with that statement? And remember, there's not a lot of questions on this, but they're going to be very specific when you get them. This is just a reminder of that valid, void, voidable. You've already seen this. For whatever reason, I got the next slide in here twice too, so I got to delete that.
What does it mean when it says recorded? I think I may have missed that.
Right here?
Yeah.
This is what it does not have to be valid.
Right, but what does that? I mean, recorded.
Sure. Yeah, let me circle back around to that. I've been using this terminology a lot. Recording something means you go down to the Register of Deeds. Okay, the Register of Deeds is located at the county courthouse. It is a room full of these big books where all these past conveyances have happened. Folks, if you were a nerd and you were into these things, you can actually go and you can find deeds that granted ownership of land from the King of England at the time, whenever it was first being colonized. There are these deeds that still exist in the public record. And so this Register of Deeds is basically a historical tome of all past transferences since it's been a thing. And so when King George or whoever, I'm not a history major, okay, when whoever granted it to, his person who came over here, don't you judge me, Stephanie, okay, I don't know who it was, all right? And then, that person broke some off and sold it to somebody else. And then that person broke it off and sold it to somebody else. And then that person broke it off and sold it to somebody else. And then it just goes on and on and on. You can go back and you can see all of these for the past couple hundred of years at this point. And so the Register of Deeds is what we call the public record. If you walk back past 123 Main Street and you're like, oh, that's a really pretty house, I wonder who owns it. You could go to the Register of Deeds and look up who the owner of record is. And that is the most recent grantee is the owner of record. So it's just quite literally, when I say recorded something, you took it down to this place, which is considered the public record, called the Register of Deeds, and you handed it to him and you said, put this in the public record. That's what recordation is. And so it serves as notice. Yep.
This is me just being, I guess, like a legal questionnaire, I guess, if you will, or just someone who's intrigued by it. Do you think that with just more, how can I say it, increased sensitivity around one's data or privacy, given like social media, technology, hacks, things of that nature, do you think they're going to start to inform how that's such accessible public knowledge?
No. I mean, we've just been, I completely get where you're going with that. The problem is, that's not where most people are getting their data. Most of the people are getting it because we're so stupid and we just put it everywhere and anywhere, I mean, there's 10 billion places to find somebody's address that's not the Register of Deeds. And because that's such an important place to, store legal data and transfer it, says for the public record, I would imagine that that's not going to change anytime soon. But for those who are very concerned about it, like celebrities, they will create dummy corporations and they will own it in the name of dummy corporations to make it harder to identify who actually owns it, if you're concerned about that. So that is a thing.
Also, correct me if I'm wrong, but you usually go by the name of the person owning it. Usually you find the name of the person owning it by the property, not vice versa, right?
Not
Like if you go in, it's not going to be labeled as Jacob's house. It's going to be labeled as 123 Main Street, and then if you look at who owns it, then you can see my name.
Gotcha. Here's the problem with that. When you own a house, the first place that people go that is the easiest to access is the tax records. And so the tax records are going to say Jacob Hale. And then what I would probably then do is turn around and look you up on the Register of Deeds and be able to see your house, your address, when you bought it and all that stuff. So, I mean, it's kind of both. You could find the name somewhere else, like the public record first, or of the tax record first, and then go there, or vice versa, like you said. Both are an option. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. So, I told you, deeds are valid as long as they contain those certain things, but in order to protect us against third-party interests, that's why we record. I used this term before. North Carolina is what we call a pure race state. Pure race state. First come, first serve. If you recorded first, you would be recognized as the owner. And we would have to go through a very lengthy court hearing to try to fix it if somebody fraudulently claimed to be the owner when they were not. So this is why we don't do real estate transactions on this antiquated, oh, it's okay if it's just valid thing. No. We do title searches as part of the actual transaction. The attorney looks it up, and in one fell swoop, the attorney will record the deed in the name of the new owner, the grantee, before they even give out any money at closing. So you're never going to see a transaction in the real world where it's not recorded. Why? Because we want to protect ourselves. When you're spending that much money, you don't want anybody to ever be able to lay claim to your property more than you can. So as we were just talking about the recordation, understand that I said it is an actual physical room called the Register of Deeds at the county courthouse. I told you Wake Counties is in Raleigh, Johnson Counties is in Smithfield, Harnett, I believe, is in Lillington. So there are a lot of Register of Deeds that now offer what's called digital or electronic recording. So you can actually just basically fax in or send in the document, notarized, and they'll put it in the public record. It used to be that you had to actually go to the physical office and give it to them in order to record it. What you got, Jacob?
Okay, so, oh shoot. It slipped.
Happens. If you think about it, let me know. So, in regard to deeds, big difference between valid and what we call effective or enforceable. So here's a little recap for you. And remember, acknowledged is just a fancy word for notarized. Pausing for dramatic effect. Y'all know how I do. It looks like some of you are still taking notes. So as I keep saying over and over and over again, we would not do a real estate transaction as a real estate broker in any way, shape, or form without recording. But that doesn't mean that it's not valid without this recordation. This recordation, as I just explained, is when you let the public know that this transfer of title happened. You record the new deed. Remember, there's not just a deed to a property. There are multiple deeds to every property. Grantor to grantee, and then that grantee is named as the grantor in the next one, so on and so forth. So it links back to all the previous conveyances. And so it's what we call constructive notice. Remember when I told you, if you drive past the house and you're like, I wonder who owns that. The presumption is you can go to the public record and probably figure out who the owner is. We call that person the owner of record. Now, once again, it's not a guarantee that they own it, but they are presumed to be the owner. And so it is your opportunity to give notice to the public that that ownership has changed when you purchase a piece of real property. As I said, we call that constructive notice. When you actually move into the property, meaning you're there, you have possession, and you have put this in, this is what we call actual notice. Because if you look at the Register of Deeds and you say, okay, well, Kirsten owns this property, it's a pretty good bet that Kirsten is the owner because she is listed as the owner of record. If you drive past the house and you see Kirsten is there and she's the owner of record, it's basically a guarantee it's her property. It's called actual notice versus constructive notice. Constructive notice is just telling the public that you probably are the owner. Actual notice is actually occupying it as well. So, I'm talking about transfer of title and deeds and legal descriptions and the difference between valid versus enforceable or effective against third-party claims. And so let me just give you an example of what a test question might potentially look like for something in this realm, okay? If we were looking right here and we were to say, which of the following is required for a deed to be enforceable and legally binding on the parties to a sales contract for the purchase of vacant land in Raleigh? Now, of course, understanding that you got to be very careful with the wording here because we don't necessarily, well, just read through it for a second and I'll explain some pieces here. Now, in this particular one, I just want to point out a few different things because sometimes the verbiage can really throw you off. So, in order to be enforceable against third-party claims is where we record it, okay? Enforceability against third-party claims, not necessarily between the parties. It being valid is enough between the two parties. So you got to be very careful with the verbiage. So remember, in order for it to be valid between the two parties, in order for it to be, recognized, in order for it to be satisfactory, it doesn't need to be recorded or anything like that. So you just got to be careful of the verbiage, folks. The only things on that list of the required elements of a deed that are on this list would be which one? There you go. You gotta be very careful because I keep saying enforceable against third-party claims. Enforceable against third-party claims. It's different than enforceable between us. So if we had the agreement, we both know that it is what it is. The reason we record is so that the third parties can't come after us and claim that they have superior title to us. So just be very, very careful with the verbiage here and look for exactly what it's asking for. Now, I already told you that North Carolina is a pure race state. Let's talk about the other things that come in with title because I want to get into some of the other fun-filled discussions that we have to have tonight, okay? First, to record is the first in right. That's what a pure race state is, and so that's why we always record at closing, so we never have to worry about somebody else, trying to defraud us or record and claim superior title against us. Now, the other reason why this pure race concept comes into play with the Register of Deeds is lien holders. We talked about liens a little bit, and I keep telling you we're going to bring liens back into this a lot in the financing section. But if I was to go out and I was to buy a property, I told you I'm going to borrow money, and I'm going to put what's called a voluntary specific lien on my property, where the bank has the right to go after it if I don't pay them. Well, folks, people can then turn around and take out home equity lines or second mortgages, and so those people would also put liens on your property because those would be recorded second. They would have second rights to go after that property, or in other words, second rights to any money. And so I briefly, earlier on, and we'll talk about it more later, talked about lien priority. Most of the time, they're paid out as first come, first served. These are these recorded liens. But then I told you that there are some that are special priority that take precedence over any other recordation. And we're going to talk more about that. But you've got to remember, and let's see if you can recall, which liens, okay, very specifically, we're talking about liens, were the highest priority liens that beat out everything else. No matter when they were recorded, there was two.
Fact.
Say it again.
Property taxes.
Real property taxes, number one. Now, Monica, mechanics liens did have a special rule where they're backdated to when work was started or materials were dropped off. But that still doesn't necessarily beat out everything. But it does have that special rule, so that's an important one to remember. There's one other, though. So the real property tax liens are going to beat out everything else except for the foreclosure cost. But, of course, foreclosure costs are not the lien itself. It's just the cost of doing a foreclosure. What was the other one?
Special assessment.
Special assessments. There you go. The special assessments liens are higher priority. So even though we are a pure race state, there are certain ones that take a higher priority for liens, even though they may have been recorded later. Now, when it comes to deeds, you know, first come, first serve. That's all this pure race state means, is if you recorded first, you are considered to be the owner in a deed or the first lien holder with the right to the property or whatever it may be.
Remind me what a special assessments lien is.
Yeah, special assessments is when somebody, typically a governing authority, a municipality, would come in and they would do something to your property and they would charge you for it. So the example I gave you is sewer. So like if they came in and they said, oh, congratulations, we ran public sewer to your area. Here's your bill for it. That would be a special assessment lien. And they would typically allow you to make payments, but they put it on a lien on your property that says, well, if you go to sell your property, you're going to have to pay this off in full. It's your problem. It's a lump sum thing. So when we're talking about title, of course, as you can realize now, it's not as straightforward as you may have thought, right? You just probably thought, oh, you buy a house, I own a house. Well, because of the nature of people stating they own it, people not recording it, certain things arising, there is the potential for what we call a cloud on title to appear or to be present. A cloud on title is anything that makes the ownership uncertain. And it could be that maybe the conveyances were weird. Maybe somebody didn't sign their rights away. Maybe there's two deeds stating that this person owns it and another one stating that this person owns it. So anytime that this happens, it's what we call a cloud on title. And of course, all of these claims would have to be in writing. And as you might imagine, if I go to buy a house from Misty and come to find out there's a cloud on title where I'm not super certain that Misty owns it, do you think I really want to buy a property from somebody if I'm not really sure that they own it? So these clouds on title are not a good thing, and so in order to be able to convey them, we need to have what we call clear title. Well, the way that we would do that if we had a cloud is what we call a suit to quiet title. It is basically a hearing with a judge where we say, okay, tell us why you think you own it. Tell us why you think you own it. And they will ultimately make a decision on who actually owns the property. This would be what would happen in an involuntary alienation by way of adverse possession dispute would look like. If I said, no, I should get to own it because I met these criteria, we would go to court and I would prove that burden of criteria for that cloud or that OCEAN acronym. And then I could potentially steal it and that would extinguish the cloud on title because I stole it from somebody else. The judge would say, yep, you own it. They're out of luck. So there's a lot of different ways this can happen. Sometimes it's something as harmless as, Monica, you, and I'm not trying to put you on the spot here. It's just a good example. Monica, you said you were divorced last week, yes?
Last week? Oh, yes, I said it last week.
You said it last week, not divorced last week. Yeah, a long time ago. So Sandoval, how do you say your last name? Sandoval. Is that your maiden name? So you've switched back.
As soon as I could.
There you go. Okay. So if in the time that Monica was married to her now ex-husband and she had a different last name and they purchased property together and then he signed over his ownership to her and then after the divorce was finalized, she switched back to her current last name and then tried to convey title. That could cause a title defect. Why? Because Monica, different last name, was the owner, and Monica Sandoval conveyed it to somebody else. And so when we look at this record, we're going to say, well, hold on, this is two different last names. Now, this is a very easy one to extinguish because all we have to do is find her divorce certificate and where she changed her legal name, and then this one's solved. Because then we say, okay, this is the same person. Here's the document. We know this is the same person. But sometimes clouds on title can be that simple. Is everybody with me? If somebody hasn't conveyed their ownership clearly, somebody's name changed, and we don't see a specific series where that happened, it could cause us to be like, hold on, and we've got to just do some additional research. That doesn't require a court hearing or a formal quiet title suit, but it is something that we would need to figure out before we transfer property. Thank you, Monica. So
my personal pain can be the benefit of the class.
there you go. That's right. It's, you know, everything's a learning experience, right? Good, bad, or otherwise. That's right. So anytime that there's any kind of question in the ownership, the transfer, folks, these are things that we want to resolve before we kind of transfer and move on into, you know, our sales that were happening here. Now, some states require what we call a title search prior to listing the property. North Carolina does not. The person who does that is the attorney in North Carolina, because we have attorney settlements, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. But they will do it for the buyer as part of the process to purchase the property, to make sure that there's no title defects that we need to be aware of, and then that way we can move to closing and transfer the ownership as per usual. Some states, as I said, do it beforehand. So I've said this over and over again, there is not just a deed. There is multiple deeds to a given piece of property, a lot. 10s, 20s, 30s, hundreds, thousands, it depends on the property. In theory, there could be as many or as few on any given piece of property, depending on how many times it's conveyed ownership. And so, as we've said, title is this concept of ownership, and the deed is to show when that transfer of title happened. Now, here's what we're going to get into the deeds themselves. Now, I want to preface this. I want to remind you when we talked about estates. And we talked about estates where we have potentially limited your ownership, right? What you can do with it, like the fee simple defeasible, also called what? What was the other name for defeasible? Qualified fee estates, that's right. And then there was the two types, right? One that was fee simple determinable, you only have this one use, or fee simple subject to condition subsequent that said you can do anything but this. Well, when we talked about those estates, we either went with those, which limited the use of the property, or we went with life estates, which limited the time that you would own the property. And what we said is, if you could give it to somebody else, you were limited to only giving them what you had. So if you had a fee simple determinable property that said you can only use this as a horse farm, if you willed it, gifted it, sold it, doesn't matter what you did, the next person could use it as only what? There you go.
A horse farm.
A horse farm. Now, do not confuse that concept with deeds, the actual physical document. Folks, all deeds show the transfer of title, and they all do it the exact same. But there are some that convey a greater level of guarantee or warranty or protection with them. And you can give a better deed than what you got. You can give a better deed than what you got. This will make more sense in a second. Hang tight. So when I list the deeds, there are several that are testable. There is a quitclaim deed, bargain and sale deed, limited warranty deed, also called a special warranty deed, a general warranty deed, and then we've got some special purpose deeds. Now, with the exception of this last one, every single one of these documents the transfer of ownership. The only difference is the guarantee or the warranty that's with them. And I want you to think about this before I go any further, folks. if you go to Walmart or Best Buy or any store for that matter, and you buy an electronic device, what do they always ask you at the cash register?
Warranty.
There you go. Do you want an additional protection plan? Do you want the unlimited warranty? Do you want the extended warranty? Do you want the whatever? And that's exactly how you should think about this. When you buy a laptop, folks, there is a manufacturer's warranty on it, typically a year. But you could get supplemental protection that's longer than that, that covers more than that. So that's all this is, different levels of protection. But in theory, they all, with the exception of the last one, because the special purpose deeds don't always automatically convey title, and I'll get to that, they all show the transfer of title from one person to another, just with different levels of guarantee or no guarantee. So if you look at this list, this is kind of outlined from lowest end to highest level when you stop at general warranty deeds for protection or guarantees. Well, I'm going to kind of put them a little bit backwards to help you understand this. When I say a guarantee, that means that we are assuring you that there is no title defects, that we are conveying good, clear title, and you have nothing to worry about. Unlike electronics, where we're like, oh, you know, if it fries, if it does this. The only thing that we really have to worry about protecting is your title, this concept of ownership. So when we give you a guarantee, we're saying, okay, well, you don't have to worry about this title because I promise it's good, right? I will fix it if it's not, right? That's kind of what we're getting into. Now, please understand that a guarantee or a warranty within the deeds is only referring to protecting title. This concept of your ownership. It has nothing to do with the house. It has nothing to do with the structure. None of that. It is only protecting your concept of ownership. Everybody okay with that statement? So even though my list started from lowest on the totem pole went to the highest, I'm going to start from the highest on the totem pole and work my way back. So let's start with a general warranty deed. Okay? When I say general warranty deed, this should be thought of as the extended bumper-to-bumper warranty, the upgraded warranty, the whatever you want to call it. And so here's how this works. If somebody transfers ownership to you by way of a general warranty deed, they have given you certain guarantees, certain warranties, certain protections. From a legal point of view, it's these covenants. Covenant of season, covenant against encumbrances, covenant of quiet enjoyment, covenant of further assurance, and covenant of warranty forever. And I'm going to explain these. But in a nutshell, this is just guaranteeing that the title they have transferred to you is good. There's no issues. You could turn around and convey it to somebody else. And if there was ever any issues, they would fix it. That's all this is. It is the full protection. Nothing to worry about. Title is good. So while they all transfer title, this is the most protection for the grantee. And it is the highest level of liability for the grantor. So let me break down the actual terminology here. Covenant of season, not like your steak, okay? Not like seasoning your meat. Covenant of season, S-E-I-S-I-N, is the right to convey. I'm giving you title to this property. You in turn have the right to transfer it to somebody else down the road. That is covenant of season. Well, folks, I want you to think back to section 2 when we talked about encumbrances. And it says covenant against encumbrances. Does anybody have a problem with that statement?
I would think that the covenant against encumbrances would be for maybe liens, financial liens, and not necessarily apparent encumbrances.
Appurtenant encumbrances, yeah. That's a great way of putting it. Now, folks, I'm going to just build on what Missy said a little bit more. It is covenant against encumbrances except those I've disclosed to you. We can never get rid of all encumbrances, right? Because public and private land use controls are encumbrances, right? The government saying that you can't build a strip club on your lot, that's an encumbrance. And so we can't do away with that. So when I say covenant against encumbrances, it's kind of like what Missy said. Covenant against the encumbrances that we can get rid of, right? We're going to get rid of the ones we can get rid of, and then the other ones you know about. That's all we mean. So covenant of quiet enjoyment. Now this is a very similar concept to that deep sea, right? When we talked about those bundle of legal rights. Disposition, exclusion, enjoyment, possession, and control. So it's very similar to that. Quiet enjoyment means nobody can claim superior title. It is yours to own. Nobody else can say that they own it more than you do. That is the covenant of quiet enjoyment. Covenant of further assurance says forever and ever. You're not going to have any issues. And then covenant of warranty forever says if there's ever an issue, I will come back and fix it. That's what that states. Okay? This is a general warranty deed. Now, interesting to note, when we get into a document in North Carolina, sales contract section, we will discuss the offer to purchase and contract standard form 2T. And when utilizing that standardized contract, it states that the seller will be conveying title to the grantee by way of a general warranty deed. Uses that verbiage verbatim. Yeah, good point. Monica, I'm glad you pointed that out because I don't want you to get confused with verbiage. So Monica says not to be confused with restrictive covenants. And that's exactly right. Covenant is just a fancy word for something kind of official, something kind of legal. And so restrictive covenants are something kind of legal, something kind of, specific. But they're not the same thing, right? So restrictive covenants would be a private land use control that we're going to talk about in just a few seconds. That are an encumbrance, but these are covenants, basically guarantees, promises, still a legal promise, a legal thing, but you're exactly right. Not the same thing as restrictive covenants. Good call. So just be careful. When we say, covenants, conditions, restrictions, we mean like restrictive covenants or protective covenants. When we say these are basically just promises or guarantees within a general warranty deed. Don't let the verbiage confuse you.
Is this coverage, general warranty, the most common?
Yes. This is the most common, hands down. Just a couple supplemental notes here. Depending on your national versus state, some states may call this the full covenant and warranty deed. Sometimes just refer to it as the warranty deed. And I told you, it's like the bumper to bumper, the extended warranty, all title, protected, guaranteed, warranted, forever and ever, amen. But more specifically, those covenant of season, covenant of further insurances, covenant of warranty forever, covenant of quiet enjoyment, all of those you could potentially see on the test.
Can you say that one more time? It was kind of chewed up a little bit. You said, I just got the last part, required enjoyment. Maybe seen on the test?
No. I'm saying all these covenants. Covenant of season, covenant against encumbrances, covenant of quiet enjoyment. All of these, you could potentially see these terms on the test.
Okay.
Yep.
Right. And are these are applicable to all deed types?
No. These are very specifically aspects of the general warranty deed. Also, sometimes it's called a warranty deed or full covenant and warranty deed.
Okay.
Yep. So all of those exist only on this deed. Go ahead, Kirsten.
National test, not state test.
Both. Could be either.
Could be on.
Yep. Could be on both. Because every single state utilizes these deeds. North Carolina, all the states. So you could see this on both. It's just, depending on the verbiage in North Carolina, you may see a question on a general warranty deed. On the national test, you could see it called a full covenant and warranty deed. We don't typically call it here, but it's the same thing. So let's move to the next one down. Okay, the next one down, I told you, is called a limited warranty deed, also sometimes referred to as a special warranty deed. You should think of that one like the manufacturer's warranty. You didn't get the upgraded warranty, but there is some coverage. Okay? So on the special warranty deed, here's the guarantee or the warranty they are giving you. They are giving you this warranty or guarantee that they have received the title to the property. And they are conveying that to you, but they are only guaranteeing that there is nothing that has happened to the title so long as they have owned it. So that's what they're saying. I own it and I'm conveying that ownership to you. And I promise there has been nothing to mess up the title so long as I've owned it. So if I've owned it for 6 years, you go back the past 6 years, I've done nothing to mess up this title that would hurt you. But I'm not making any promises prior to that. If there's anything that comes up from before my ownership, you're on your own. This is a special or limited warranty deed. So a lot of times banks will utilize this in foreclosures. Because they say, okay, yeah, when we, let me explain something. I told you a foreclosure is the bank forcing the sale of the property. But sometimes they bid on their properties at auction, and sometimes they win. And that's when you end up with what's called a bank-owned property, also called an REO-owned property. And so then they will turn around and they will list it and they'll sell it. REO stands for real estate owned. It's just a funny terminology for the bank owns it. And so when they go to sell it, normally they will grant a special warranty deed. And they'll basically say, yeah, we bought it at auction. And so we've done nothing in the time we've owned it, but we're not promising that there's nothing that happened to the title before we purchased it. So that's very commonly associated with a real estate owned property. They're just saying, I promise it's good for the time I owned it, and I promise I own it, and I'm giving it to you. That's a special warranty deed. Believe it or not, this is actually very common with new construction as well. A lot of new construction will do special warranty deeds just because of that. Yeah, I know. Just because you got to understand, going back to my transference history lesson, some of these properties have been in people's families for 300 years, and then they buy these 300, 400 acre parcels and subdivide them. And then, so they're basically saying in the time that we've owned it and subdivided it and sold it to you, we didn't do anything, but we can't guarantee anything from the past 300 years where old Farmer Brown owned this property and had 17 siblings and 17 wives, that things get a little iffy. So that is a special warranty deed. Still some warranties, okay, just not as much.
So with that example that you just used, would you see something like that more common like in Florida, where the land is separating from the foundation is separating from the land because of like marsh and swamp territory and things like that?
No. No, remember, all this only has to do with the concept of ownership and nothing to do with the physical property itself. It has nothing to do with topography, nothing to do with the structures, nothing to do with the improvements, the concept of ownership that's being conveyed to you. That's it. So let's take one more step down. The next one is called a bargain and sale deed. Now this is where things get a little bit fun. A bargain and sale deed has no express warranties or guarantees. This basically is a deed that says, I think I own it, and now I'm transferring that ownership to you. That's it. I think I own it, and now I'm transferring that ownership to you. I'm not making any promises about the ownership before me. I'm not guaranteeing anything. I think I own it, and I'm giving it to you. Let me give you an example, okay? Let's say tomorrow morning you get a phone call from an attorney who is handling a probate or estate thing out in, Idaho, okay? And you get a phone call, and this attorney on the phone says, hey, listen, you had a great uncle named Steve, and he just died. And you were his only living relative, and he left you a 320-acre llama farm. Congratulations. Well, folks, unless it's your dream to own a llama farm, more than likely, you're probably going to call up an attorney and a real estate agent, and you're going to put that property on the market out in Idaho, and you are going to sell it, and you're going to take the money because you didn't even know you had an Uncle Steve. And you've never even thought about being a llama farmer. So because you've never been there, you've never met this man, you just had somebody tell you that you inherited this property, you're probably going to convey ownership by way of a bargain and sale deed. Hey, listen, I think I own it. Some attorney said I do. And I'm giving it to you, but I'm not making any promises or warranties about the ownership of the property. Go ahead.
This is gifted property. This is not property I'm selling to you.
It could be sold. There is no rules that saying this has to be one or the other. I mean, most of us would probably not be willing to pay a whole lot for something that we're not even sure, anything about it. But it could absolutely be sold. Because think about it. I got it from my great uncle Steve, but if I turn around and sell it to you, Kirsten, I'm giving you this. You're paying for this property. But I'm not going to promise anything about the title. I'm going to say, listen, I'm pretty sure I own it, and I'm giving that ownership to you, and you're paying me for it.
So does that mean when Kirsten goes to sell it, does that mean that she still has a bargain and sale deed, or does that mean that she has, say, a special warranty deed because she, quote unquote, knows she owns it because she bought it?
Nope. Here's the thing. Nothing automatically changes. You have to thoughtfully record this at the Register of Deeds at the time of the closing. And so Kirsten has what I gave her, the bargain and sale deed. But this is where I told you, Jacob, just because that's all Kirsten has doesn't mean that she can't upgrade it. If she wants to, if she's feeling froggy, she could sell it and convey the ownership by way of a general warranty deed. This, with the deeds, don't confuse it. You can give a better one than what you received.
Yeah, and that's what I'm saying. So,
not automatic though.
Yeah, but that's what I'm saying. So, but like, if Kirsten, says, okay, I think I own this property. I got it from Uncle Steve, and now I'm selling it to Seth. And then you go and get it registered, get the deed registered in the office or whatever. Then, whenever you go to sell it, you can sell it as, say, a special warranty deed, because that means you own it, and in your time, you haven't done anything to affect the title, right?
Understand that there's no course of action that has to happen. Let me just make sure we're all on the same page here. Uncle Steve died, and he left me a llama farm. Didn't know Uncle Steve, didn't know anything. I would get what's called a executor's deed or a trustee's deed. That's how I'm going to inherit it. It's going to be one of these special purpose deeds. Okay, I'm going to get it, and we haven't talked about those yet. There are special purpose deeds that transfer ownership from, the executor of an estate, a will, or something like that. So I'd probably end up getting an executor's deed. But then when I turn around and I sell it to Kirsten, I have an executor's deed, which is how I got it. But I'm going to turn around and I'm going to say, okay, I'm only willing to convey bargain and sale deed to you because I think I own it, but I'm not making any other promises. So now Kirsten owns it with this bargain and sale deed. It's entirely up to her. Let's say 10 years from now, she wants to sell it to you, Jacob. It's up to you and her on whether or not she's willing to give you anything more than this bargain and sale deed. If she wants to give you the limited or special warranty deed, she could. If she wants to give you a general warranty deed, she could. If she wants to just give you the bargain and sale deed, she could. If she wants to give you something lesser than that, she could. It's all up to negotiation. There's no
That makes sense, but I guess my question was, at that point, she doesn't have to do anything except for maybe get it registered for her to be able.
No. Don't say registered. There's nothing to.
No, she doesn't even have to.
No. When I say register of deeds, you only register or go to this register of deeds and record is the word. Record the new deed showing the transfer of title. There's nothing Kirsten would do until she was transferring ownership. And the only difference is on a piece of paper. Let me show you all this real quick. Let me see if I still have it pulled up. I do. Remember last week I showed you this copy of this deed? And of course it's going to be...
think that maybe I'm not understanding you, or you're not understanding my question. One of the two.
Well, unfortunately, Jacob, I'm understanding your question, but it's not formulated in a way that I can answer it. So let me show you this, and maybe this will help. Here you go. So I showed y'all this last week, and this was a great example for a lot of things. And look right here on this piece of paper, North Carolina General Warranty Deed. The only thing that would change is when an attorney or whoever drafts up the next one showing the conveyance from Kirsten to you is what you put there. That's the only thing that matters. And then that would be recorded. Is Kirsten willing to have an attorney type up North Carolina General Warranty Deed, which means she's making all these promises? Is she willing to have it typed up to say Special Warranty Deed, where she's just making the promise to you and the time she's owned it? That is the only thing that it comes down to. And so there's nothing to register until she transfers ownership. And the attorney's going to type this up, and then they're going to record it. So it's whatever you and Kirsten negotiate that she's willing to give you and you're willing to accept. And so if you both come to terms that she's only comfortable with giving you a special warranty deed, she tells the attorney that that's what she wants to do, that's what will happen.
Okay, so maybe I don't understand then. Do you just, so you don't have to do, right? Because part of the general warranty deed, right, is it means that the title is good, it's full protection, you're guaranteeing that there's no discrepancies or anything like that before you. So you're meaning to tell me that I can promise that without actually knowing that?
Absolutely.
Okay.
There you go. There you go. You can promise that without actually knowing that, because think about it. If any of you own new construction homes right now, you probably have a special warranty deed. But when you go to sell your house in North Carolina, the contract will state you were required to convey by way of a general warranty deed. Folks, is there any way that you know about what happened before you owned it? No. So you can make this promise, you can make this guarantee without having a freaking clue how much liability you're giving yourself. That's exactly right. That's a great way to put it, Jacob.
Sounds risky.
It absolutely does, which is why it is the highest form of liability for the grantor, but the best one for the grantee. Now, here's the really ironic thing, and then I'll get your question, Misty. Folks, understand that these grantors make these promises, but do you think that any of us actually keep tabs on the previous owner? I have no idea where the person who sold me my house is. So how the hell am I going to find them and make them make good on these promises? Good luck. It's the silliest thing that we even make these promises, because what you'll find is we really rely on what's called title insurance. There's this third-party insurance that we have that protects our ownership of title, because the grantor typically just disappears off the face of the earth. If you could find them, you could potentially hold them to this. So it's rather a silly thing, Jacob, right? Like, we make these promises, but we're not actually holding anybody accountable for them, really. They just disappear. Was that your question, Misty? Yeah.
That was just a statement I was going to make. I mean, they're making a promise, but it's the title insurance that's going to cover the promise.
Yeah, which is why it's kind of a silly concept to even like teach you these different types of deeds, right? Because as Jacob said, and as you said, you can make a promise without knowing whether it's a risky promise or not. And nobody's really holding you to it because you've got title insurance, which we're going to talk about in just a second.
Yeah, see, I misunderstood. I thought that, like, to grant a general warranty deed, you had to, like, go to the county.
Yeah, and make these promises and actually, yep.
And, look at backdated everything as far as it goes to, like, check for discrepancy.
Yeah.
I didn't realize that it was just a bullshit. Okay.
That's exactly what it is. Yeah. See, and that's why. So I'm glad you asked the questions, because I wasn't quite getting where you're coming from, and that helped me, and that helped you. So that's great. Yeah. So bargain and sale deed, basically, as I said, just says, yeah, I think I own it and I'm conveying it to you. Very commonly associated with something like, an inheritance or, sometimes, once again, foreclosures or auctions or things of that nature. Now, when we're talking about this, there's one step further, and that's a quitclaim deed. And so for all intents and purposes, they're very similar. But here's the thing. A bargain and sale deed says, I believe I own the property, right? There's at least this assumption that for some reason or another, I feel like I own it. But I'm not promising or guaranteeing anything. A quitclaim deed doesn't even do that. Folks, before I go into the in-depth conversation with a quitclaim deed, where have you heard a quitclaim deed commonly utilized? Cars could be.
Foreclosure?
Could be. There's another time that it's more common.
To remove a cloud on the title.
To remove a cloud on the title. And I'll give you a specific one. We just talked about it. Divorce. Divorce. Folks, a quitclaim deed is exactly what it sounds like. It is somebody quitting their claim on a property. And so it is used, as Misty said, to clear a cloud on title. And it is sometimes used to clear cloud on title caused by divorce. So when we're dealing with a quitclaim deed, here's the difference between a bargain and sale deed and a quitclaim deed. I don't know if I own it or not. But if I do, it's yours. That's it. I don't know if I own it or not. But if I do, it's yours. And so think about it, folks. I told you when we were talking about tenancy by the entirety in marital estates that if you were to own a property in severalty, what does severalty mean?
In totality.
Yeah, by yourself, right? In totality, by yourself. So ownership in severalty, and then you turn around and you get married and you do not sign a prenuptial agreement. Your new spouse has what's called a marital interest in your property. Folks, even if it's only a 6-month marriage and then you turn around and you get separated and then eventually get divorced, they still have a marital interest in your property. So when you go to sell your house, there is a cloud on title because there's this assumption that your spouse might still be owed something on your property because you got married and you never settled it. That is called a marital interest. So the only way that you can convey your property by way of clear title is to go to your ex and ask them to sign a quitclaim deed that states that they are quitting their claim against your property. If they do have ownership, they don't know how much, so they're not making any promise. I don't know if I own anything or not, and if I do, I have no idea how much. But regardless, I'll sign this and it's yours. That is a quitclaim deed. This also sounds very messy. It is, but sometimes it's just for convenience because people want no liability at all, right? They just want zero liability in any way, shape, and form. I'll give you a real-world example of this, and it's kind of a funny thing. Of course, I've been in real estate for over 8 years now, and I've been teaching it for a while, and so I kind of, have to talk about a lot of this stuff. And so my dad got remarried later in life. And his wife was from California, and she moved out here, and they were living together in a house that they both purchased together. And I don't remember the exact reason, but ultimately what ended up happening is at some point he signed away his ownership to the property that they had here. But he stayed living in it, and she moved back to California. And he's making all the payments, and he's taking care of it, and he's doing all these things. And he was looking at the house, and I was helping him talk through like a refi and all these different things because I guess it was in her name and she didn't want to deal with it anymore. I said, Dad, this isn't good. I said, you don't have any legal ownership on this property. You've signed your rights away to this house by way of, and I don't even remember exactly how he did it. But when they bought it, they were both named on a general warranty deed. And I'm assuming maybe he signed his ownership away with a quitclaim deed. And I don't know the reason. I was like, Dad, this isn't good because you live there. You're making the payments. She owns it. And he's like, I'm not worried about it. She would give it right back to me and we'll get it worked out. He was right. She gave it right back to him. So she just wanted it off her credit report because he was paying for it and it was still in her name. And so she turned around, even though she owned it by way of a general warranty deed. She turned around and she just went to her attorney and she signed a quitclaim deed. And she just quitclaimed her rights to my dad. And now he is the completely legal owner. Now he's not too worried about that. Why? Because he knew that they had owned it for like 15 years together. And so he wasn't really worried about title defects or anything. So remember when I told you, they all do the same thing. Even though this is the lowest end of the totem pole, her signing that was enough to say he is the owner. There's no question about that. And when he goes to sell it, he will very gladly sign a general warranty deed to the next person. You can give more or less than what you have. They all transfer ownership. It's just very different promises, very different guarantees. Everybody with me? So the last ones on the list were special purpose deeds. And there's several of them. And so some of these are going to make more sense when we get into the financing. Of course, there's no perfect way to teach this course where we don't end up introducing concepts that we haven't delved into, right? Liens, you've already experienced that. I haven't talked about liens to the extent that I need to yet. Same thing with these certain deeds. We're going to talk about them more in the financing section. So a correction deed, folks, is not transferring ownership, but I want to circle back around to the Register of Deeds. It's an actual place with actual documents that are stored. And so when you look at the Register of Deeds online, that is just a digital catalog of the physical room that is the Register of Deeds. But the Register of Deeds is a physical place. As such, it's not like a Word document where you can just delete stuff. Once it's in the Register of Deeds, it's in the public record forever. You cannot remove anything from the Register of Deeds. Well, folks, we're human. There are times that we make mistakes. So every once in a while, something is typed wrong. Like instead of 123 Main Street, they accidentally type 124 Main Street. Or maybe instead of, green, Green, they put an E on the end. And so now it's confusing because it's not the right name. Well, a correction deed would just be recorded to say, hey, remember this deed where we transferred ownership from this person to that person? Here's a deed to supplement that where we spelled the name wrong. We can't delete anything, so we would just have to create new documents to fix those. It's called a correction deed. Now, when we talk about foreclosures, the way that the bank transfers title after a foreclosure depends on the state. We have what we call lien theory states and title theory states. And that's going to make more sense in the financing section. But North Carolina is a title theory state, and we would transfer ownership after a foreclosure by way of a trustee's deed. In lien theory states, it is what we call a judicial foreclosure, and they would transfer ownership by way of a sheriff's deed. And then a deed of gift is exactly what it sounds like. It is where you deed somebody ownership as a gift. That's a thing. Told you. Doesn't technically have something of value, but as long as you say, yeah, I wanted to do this because I care about this person, it's enough. Now, the only other deeds that really get an honorable mention, and I can't remember if they're coming up on the next slide or not, or the next couple slides or not, but I just want to go ahead and mention them. Timber deed, oil deed, things like that. You can have a deed that transfers specific rights. Remember how we said those subsurface rights are severable? Mineral, oil, and gas rights, you would have a mineral deed or an oil deed or a timber deed. It's just conveying the rights to certain resources on the property. Not full ownership of the property, but certain rights.
I'm sorry, I missed what the sheriff's deed was.
Yeah, the sheriff's deed is how you would transfer ownership to somebody who bought a house after a foreclosure auction in a lien theory state. So the sheriff actually comes to the house, orders the other people to evacuate, and so the sheriff issues what's called a writ of possession, and then they transfer ownership to the next person by way of a sheriff's deed. And we're going to talk a lot more about that in the future in the financing sections. Yep.
So you said timber, mineral, and what was the other one?
Oil and gas.
Thank you.
Yep. So you can have deeds to just give rights to certain resources. In theory, you could have somebody draft up, a lithium mining deed or, any resource. There's just special types of resource deeds. And I'm sorry, Misty, I see your comment. Was that just a general comment or is that something I need to clarify?
So there's a question on the chat that asked, is there a precise, I lost it, hold on. Is there a precise summary of quitclaim's definition? So I just wrote out from the book what it says.
I apologize, and I missed that comment by Josh. Thank you.
No worries.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Jacob, you might not need to live in the year 2024, my man. Them AirPods ain't doing you any favors.
I know, man. My girlfriend opened up her phone and it connected to my headphone.
Was she watching cat videos and you just, start hearing those? Or
She was sitting there watching TikTok, and then I texted her and I was like, hey, will you disconnect from my AirPod? And then the text message just came through my own AirPod.
Yeah, there you go. These real quick, little rundown, and I've, of course, we'll get these recordings up, and we're going to talk more about these, kind of later. But a correction deed is just recording a new document to say, oops, we made an error on the previous deed because we can't delete anything from the Register of Deeds. So we got the address wrong, we got a name wrong or something like that. A trustee's deed is used to transfer ownership after a foreclosure in a title theory state like North Carolina. And so that'll make more sense down the road. But when you buy a house at a foreclosure auction in North Carolina, you would have the ownership granted to you by way of a trustee's deed. If you purchased a house via a foreclosure auction in a lien theory state, which North Carolina is not, you would get that ownership transferred to you by way of a sheriff's deed. And then a deed of gift is exactly what it sounds like. It is where somebody has gifted you ownership. So there's technically no consideration per se, but I like this person or whatever. And then the last ones that were honorable mentions on here were timber deed, which can convey the rights to cut timbers, oil and gas rights deeds, mineral deeds. Those would convey the rights to resources on the property, not full ownership rights to the property. Because remember, those rights are severable.
So is there ever a time where, and I might be confusing everyone and I apologize, but if we go back to quitclaim deeds and someone doesn't have any interest at all, but they thought that they did, how does that transaction follow through?
It really wouldn't mean anything because obviously, let's say that, I'm trying to think of a good way to put this. You're not typically doing it at random. There's a reason that we have to do it. And so because we don't know that you own it or not, we just don't want there to ever come a time where you come back and you say, hey, I think I own that property, because now we got a cloud on title. And so let me give you an example, Josh. The property that I have in Georgia, I purchased it after I inherited 1/8 of it, and I told you I purchased the other shares from my cousins. And in North Carolina, you automatically have a marital interest in property when you get married. Well, I don't know about Georgia. And so 2 of my cousins were married at the time that I bought that property, but their spouses didn't sign. And so could I have gone back to the attorney and said, no, I want them to sign a quitclaim deed? And the attorney could have told me, well, they don't have any rights in Georgia, so that's not necessary. I could have insisted that they sign one just to protect myself, but it would hold no validity. We would never have a situation where somebody's trying to sign one and they have no ownership, right? Like I can't just like walk up to who haven't I not picked on Sam and say, Sam, I'd like to quit claim just Josh's house to you. You know, that would hold no validity. It's only under certain circumstances that we need to resolve this cloud. There has to be something present for us to want to do this.
Right. Okay, so
And if you end up not having any ownership, then nothing's changed. It's just we have this document just in case.
okay.
Don't overthink some of these things because, of course, there's going to be very testable concepts, and there are times where students ask me, well, what if this person died, but then they had this half ownership with this person, but then this person signed this, and then we're not going to get into all that because I'm not an attorney, and that's why we have the legal system. So if there's something weird, it would be a case-by-case basis, and that's where a suit to quiet title would come into play. If there's any inkling to think that somebody does or does not have interest, go to court, let Judge Judy decide. No.
Thank you. Sorry about that.
No, you're fine. Always ask questions. What you got, Adriana?
So, the grantor initiates the quit claim deed to protect himself from the grantee so if he will one day ever claim that he had any right. So that's the grantor protecting himself. Is that right?
No. So that's a really good question, and let me explain because I don't want you to get confused, okay? I'm going to pick on my buddy Monica again just because we've already talked about her divorce. So let's say Monica and her husband owned 123 Main Street. And Monica and her husband get divorced. And in the divorce, she gets 123 Main Street. Well, understand that there is a general warranty deed that shows both of them owning the property where they owned it together. And then husband will sign the quitclaim deed. And in that quitclaim deed, he is quitting his claim to Monica. So husband is the grantor on this quitclaim deed. Monica is the grantee. He is taking any rights he may or may not have as the grantor and giving them back to Monica. And so now Monica would hold full and clear title when we looked in a title search. So then when Monica goes to sell the house, Monica solely is the grantor and the new owner is the grantee. And she would probably do that by way of a general warranty deed. So it's the person quitting their claim is the grantor on a quitclaim deed. And the person who is getting that claim extinguished or receiving that potential rights is the grantee on that quitclaim deed. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Yeah, good question. So this is just talking about the special deeds that I just mentioned, trustee's deed. I'm not going to spend too much time here because we're going to talk about this more in a second, okay? So just trustee's deed transfers title at a foreclosure auction in a title theory state, which North Carolina is. The sheriff's deed transfers title in a lien theory state at a foreclosure auction, which North Carolina is not a lien theory state. I know this sounds confusing because I haven't taught you that yet, but you will get there. Okay, sometimes I just have to give you like mini lessons on things and you got to wait for the full lesson to come up down the road, as I was saying with like liens earlier. And then here's those couple that I was mentioning before. Deed of gift, correction deed, timber deed, mineral deed. Now the one that I didn't mention is a deed in lieu of foreclosure. I told you foreclosure is the bank forcing the sale of your home. They're not taking it. Sometimes they do inadvertently end up with it because they bid on it at the auction and win. But if the banks were threatening you by way of a foreclosure, sometimes you can avoid the foreclosure by just offering to sign the deed over to them. So that is called a deed in lieu of foreclosure. Hey, I know you're going to force a sale at auction. How about I just sign ownership over to you and I'll just walk away, and that saves you having to go through the foreclosure and you would just own it outright. That's a deed in lieu of foreclosure.
a reason somebody might do that, right? Because doesn't a foreclosure really like hurt and impact your credit? So like, wouldn't somebody do that to maybe try to save their credit a little bit?
They could. Understand that there are still some serious ramifications from a deed in lieu of foreclosure because they could still potentially file a deficiency judgment against you for money they didn't receive. But that is better than a foreclosure, potentially.
Is this kind of what like Open Door would use?
What, the deed in lieu of foreclosure? No, they Open Door actually just buys the properties outright. So typically they would gain property by way of a general warranty deed. So if you were to call Open Door and you say, well, hey, what would you give me for my house? Open Door is going to make you an offer. They're going to buy your house for a certain price, become the owner of it, and then they're going to turn around. Oops. They're going to turn around and they're going to sell that property to somebody else for more money, but you got the convenience of not having to go through the process. So they typically get it by way of a general warranty deed, although as a company, they typically like to convey by way of a special warranty deed as well because they don't want those liabilities. But the deed in lieu of foreclosure would involve the bank or a lien holder. Yeah. So we've already talked about this quite a bit, but of course it keeps coming back up. Recordation. When I say recording, you've already asked this. You did a great job asking this, and I've clarified it, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these slides. Recording is taking something to the Register of Deeds and giving constructive notice or public notice, okay? Telling the public that something has happened. Whether that be a deed transference, whether that be a lien against the property, whatever it may be, it is recorded to tell the public that this is a thing. And I told you that is called constructive notice. Constructive notice is letting the public know, okay? If the public wanted to find out, they could go and see that these things exist. That's called constructive notice. And then I told you physically taking possession of the property on top of that, meaning occupying it, is what we call actual notice. Monica, attorneys are expensive. They're very expensive.
I'm just saying if people may default to the quick, the things in lieu of a battle.
Deed in lieu of foreclosure, that's exactly right. Especially in lien theory states, which are judicial foreclosures and typically do involve attorneys. That's right.
Yeah, or if you own more than the house is worth, you can just let it go and do lien. I've done that before, so
yeah. That's where the deed in lieu of foreclosure. That actually happened with a client, Kingsley. I had a house that I listed for sale a couple years ago, and God, it had a lot of potential, but they owed more on the house than it was worth because it just needed so much work. And so I tried to sell it, but ultimately I couldn't for what we needed to satisfy the liens. And so they just talked to the bank about doing a deed in lieu of foreclosure because it was an inherited property. It wasn't even theirs. So they inherited it and they're like, listen, we're just going to sign this over to you. We don't want it. And get it out of our hands, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm going to switch to this slide and I'm going to put this one up and we'll talk about these last several things when we get back from break. So, as we're sitting here talking about transfer of title and deeds and public records, there's a lot of terminology I keep using and I'm trying to make sure I explain it as we go along. And so I keep using this word priority. Priority is that first come, first serve. When we're dealing with liens, as I told you, North Carolina is a pure race state. First recorded, first paid out. And so why is that important? Well, if a lien holder puts a lien on 123 Main Street, and they're the first one, and then there's a second mortgage, and then there's a home equity line of credit, and then there is a real property tax lien that's recorded way after. Well, because I told you that's the highest priority automatically by law, it'll get moved up to here. And so if any of these lien holders were to foreclose, this is the order that the monies would be paid out in. So let's say that there's not enough money to pay everybody. This is why it's good to be first. If there's enough money to pay off the new tax lien. Maybe there's enough money to pay off the second lien. But what if there's not enough money to pay off lien holders now 3 and 4 as things have changed? This is why priority matters. Because when we're talking about a foreclosure, the cost of the foreclosure is always the first to be paid. And then liens are first come, first serve, unless it's those special priority ones. Special priority ones, real property tax liens beat out everything else. Special assessments beat out everything else but real property tax liens, and everything else is order of recordation, except, as Monica said earlier, mechanics liens. Mechanics liens have that special thing where you can't record the lien until you finish the work, but it backdates to the day that you started the work or that you dropped off materials, whichever was first. And so that's what this priority means. Now, the unrecorded ones, I talked about that as well already. When we started teaching you about real property taxes, the Machinery Act and all that stuff last week, we were dealing with tax liens in North Carolina. And I said, January 1, you were said to have a tax lien on your property. Well, they don't actually record a tax lien against your property in the Register of Deeds on January 1. We know that you owe it. We know that if you don't pay it, it'll be recorded. So it is a lien that's said to be on, but they don't record it against your property until it's technically past due, even though we know that you owe it that year. So that'd be an unrecorded document prior to the actual recordation of it. Now, as we continue with these discussions in the Register of Deeds and title, I keep mentioning title searches. This is where the attorney in our state, in other states they use title companies. They will take a look at the past conveyances, and they're trying to make sure that there are no title defects, no clouds on title. And so that is what we call a chain of title, because if you look right now on a deed, let's say the house I own, we're going to see me named as the grantee and the person I bought it for named as the grantor. And so when you see that as the most recent deed, I am presumed to be the owner of record. The most recent deed, the grantee is presumed to be the owner of record. But what you should also see when you look back is you should see a place where this person who sold it to me was named as the grantee and they got it from a previous grantor. And then if you look back before that, this person should have a deed where they were named as the grantee and there should be a previous grantor. And so every conveyance should link to the last one. That is called a chain of title. They are linked together just like a chain. Chain of title. Now, you can go back sometimes, as I said, hundreds of years to see the previous conveyances. Now, specifically in North Carolina, when we are doing a title search, when we are looking at this chain of title, we only go back 30 years. And the reason we do that is because of something very specific in North Carolina called the North Carolina Marketable Title Act. The North Carolina Marketable Title Act. And what that basically states is if there was any claim against a property that's older than 30 years old, it's been extinguished. Shucks to suck, Chuck, your claim doesn't exist anymore. So we only go back 30 years because we basically invalidated any claims that may be older than that. So let's say that there's a deed that exists where your great-great-grandmother wrote it out where you would own property, and you never bothered to see it, and you never noticed it, and it was 40 years ago that she recorded that. You don't own it anymore. Because you have missed your window of opportunity to go against that claim or go for that claim. So if it's older than 30 years, tough cookies. That's why we only do title searches 30 years in North Carolina.
And what was that called again?
The deed searches can be done for 100 years. They messed me up with that the first.
Well, you can do deed searches as far back as you want to go. And some states do them,
Crazy amount of time.
crazy amount of time. That's exactly right. But because of our laws in North Carolina, we only have to go back 30 years because we will not recognize in the state of North Carolina ownership claims older than 30. But you're exactly right. That doesn't mean every state. So it is called the North Carolina Marketable Title Act. I should have that on a slide somewhere. If not, it just got moved around. Let me see. There we go. That's the word right there. Marketable Title Act. North Carolina Marketable Title Act. Let me backtrack because I skipped forward to show you that. I already told you about a couple of these things, but when we're looking at this title, this concept of ownership, there are several big things that they're looking for. 5 specific criteria to consider it marketable, free and clear, title. Free of significant liens and encumbrances. In other words, we know what they are and they can be satisfied. No serious title defect that can't be resolved. No questions of law or fact that questions its validity, meaning transfers when somebody didn't have the legal right to, a minor, anything of that nature. Promise of quiet enjoyment to grantee. Once again, those conveyances where nobody else can claim superior title or superior ownership. And then, of course, the last piece is being reasonably assured of fair market value. Folks, when we're dealing with real property, if it's not anything of value, that kind of changes this concept of ownership. Now, most properties always have value. Don't get so caught up on this one because it's not really like a question of did you get a good deal on it or not. Well, let me give you an example here. If I gave you a property, but I stated that you could never transfer that property to anyone else, it has utility. You could use it, but it doesn't have value because you could never sell it. You could never give it to anybody else. Does that make sense? It lacks value because you can't do anything with it but own it. It still has utility. It still has use, but value is this concept of somebody being willing to buy it, pay for it, or something like that. And if they can't, then it doesn't have value. Now, some of these concepts just get, rehashed and rehashed and rehashed. So, I'm not trying to, speed through anything, but we've already talked about it.
So we're talking about marketable titles. What exactly does that mean?
If I offer to sell you my house, but we looked back at past conveyances and it didn't even look like I really owned it, and if I did, it's not very clear, and if there's a lot of title defects, and if it wasn't worth anything, do you still want it? Are you willing to pay me for it? That's exactly it, right? That's all it comes down to is you are assured that when you buy it, you're not going to have any issues turning around and selling it to somebody else. That is marketable title, that you could turn around and sell it to somebody else, that it does hold value for somebody because there's no questions of you now being the owner. That's all it comes down to.
I have a quick question, and I know you said it, I just don't feel good.
Sure.
You have to have all 5 criteria for marketable title, correct? Not just one.
Yes. Yes. All 5 criteria to a very reasonable extent. Now, this is where you... Say again, Monica?
Good question.
Yeah, it is a good question. And understand that, when you're looking at these criteria in this title search, this allows the attorney in North Carolina and title companies in other states to issue their opinion of title. Okay, and that's where this title assurance comes in. So what they basically say is we've looked at these criteria and we say that this is good, clear, marketable title. Only an attorney in our state or a title company can give that opinion of title. A real estate broker can't. And so that's why we call it title insurance. Assurance that it is good, clear, marketable title. And they will, if it was lacking one of these or if one of them was iffy, that's where that suit to quiet title would come in. That before we gave it our opinion of clear title, we might need to resolve a minor defect or something like that.
So this basically just means that a lawyer can give this property a thumbs up and say, yeah, this property's pretty much good because I looked at these 5 things and it seems clear.
That's exactly right.
Okay.
Yep. So an attorney is going to give you the thumbs up and says this looks good, or they're going to say there is a title defect and we need to resolve it before I think it looks good. And so the reason this comes into play, folks, I'm going to make a very important distinction here. Do not ever confuse title assurance with title insurance. Okay? Do not ever confuse title assurance with title insurance, because the attorney in our state will, as Jacob said, give us a thumbs up and say, yep, in my opinion, there's nothing to worry about. Well, that makes us feel good, warm and fuzzy as buyers, but more than anything, it makes the title insurance companies feel warm and fuzzy to the extent that they are willing to issue you a title insurance policy. It's kind of like people needing to see your house before they give you homeowners insurance. They're not going to take your word on it that it hasn't already burned down. They need to see that it's okay before they'll give you insurance. Kind of the same thing with a title insurance company. They need this good, clear opinion from an attorney saying, yeah, there's nothing to worry about, before they will give you title insurance on the property. Now, we're going to talk more about title insurance in just a second. But I said if there's anything that is, a cloud, a defect, sometimes it's called an abstract, this is where a suit to quiet title comes into play to extinguish that claim. I told you it could be a quick claim deed, it could be a hearing, it could be any number of things. It could just be finding a marriage certificate where people, change their last names and it was never shown up. And so the abstract of title is basically this crazy list. It's called an abstract of title, where the attorney says it was deeded from this person to this person on this date and time, this person to this person on this date and time, this person to this person on this date and time, this person got married, and so it says this name, but it's actually this name, and then this, it's just a document that they issue that shows their title search and everything they looked at, called the abstract of title.
And the abstract of title, is that part of the chain of title? It goes back 30 years?
Yep. That is the actual physical document that shows everything that they found. So title assurance is given to you by whoever does the title search after they look through these marketable criteria. Now, I told you in North Carolina, we utilize attorneys to do our settlement meetings and our title searches. In other states, those lien theory states typically that I keep talking about, and we're going to discuss more down the road, they use title companies. Really and truthfully, the methodology is similar. It's just the way that the closings are handled are a little bit different. And there's a slide for that in just a second, so I'm going to hold off on that. But here's that abstract of title, the written history of all title conveyances as summarized from their title search. Now here's where I want to get into a more in-depth warning or word of caution on title insurance, okay? There are multiple types of taxes in this class. There are multiple types of insurances in this class. And you've got to keep them all straight or it will eat you alive on a test. So when I say title insurance, it is insurance on the concept of ownership. As I mentioned earlier, these warranties on title, these insurances on title, these have nothing to do with your physical property. It is not protecting your house, your structure, your improvements. It is an insurance policy on the concept of ownership. And so when you get car insurance, for example, you pay a premium each month and you are basically betting that you are going to have an accident. If you've never thought about it that way, that's what you're doing. Auto insurance is you betting that you're going to have an accident and the insurance company is betting that you're not. And what you've basically done is you've paid them to take the liability of if you have had an accident. So most insurance policies, you pay monthly premiums and you're paying for things that could happen. Title insurance is the exact opposite. It is not a monthly premium. It is a one-time premium paid at closing. And all it covers is the past. Things outside of your control. It will not cover any future events. But when the attorney issues this opinion of title and they say it's good, This title insurance company comes in and they say, well, I'm going to give you a policy. I'm going to say, okay, if we missed anything, if there's ever something that pops up that makes us come into question on, do you actually own this or not? We will fix it. That's what they're saying. A title insurance policy is them basically saying, if we missed anything and the title's not as good as we thought it was, we'll fix it, whatever that looks like. Either by, paying out for your loss of monies because you don't own it and you invested all this money into it. Or maybe they would pay to hire an attorney to go and file a suit to have a suit to quiet title or a quitclaim deed signed by somebody. Whatever that is, they'll handle it. That is a title insurance policy. And this is where we were kind of laughing earlier. And like Misty said, it's kind of laughable that we even have these warranties in a general warranty deed, because what we're really relying on for title issues coming up is this title insurance policy to kick in. Not the previous owner, even though we made him promise something to us. It's the title insurance policy. Now, important notes on the test, folks. When you are borrowing money, the banks make you have a policy for yourself called the borrower's title insurance policy, and they make you have a policy for them called the lender's title insurance policy. As the borrower, you have to pay both. They say, well, we're lending you all this money, Slick. You go ahead and pay for our policy. Still just a one-time premium. One other note, as it states here, the lender's policy expires at a very specific date and time when you've paid off your house. If they got no more interest in your property, their policy's done. Yours would continue on past that. But do not ever confuse title insurance with any other type of insurance, because it acts very differently. Everybody still okay out there? Go ahead.
Since I can't find the title assurance in the book, I'm on page 84, 85, 86, and 87.
It may just be called opinion of title.
Now, it does have the opinion of title.
It's the same thing.
Okay.
Yeah, and that's what you have to understand, because there's this national, there are different textbooks, and that's why I keep saying be careful, because some states call it this, some states call it that. It's the same thing. Title assurance and opinion of title, they're the same from a national point of view. It's just...
Okay, so I probably should write title assurance next to that.
Yeah, you could see that in North Carolina, right? Title assurance issued as an opinion of title by an attorney. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that's on 87.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, it's crazy. I honestly wish that they would just completely remove, the national portion of the exam and just have a state, because there are these terminologies that differ so much from state to state. And so sometimes we're if you're reviewing some of the national prep material, you're going to hear things that we've never used in North Carolina, but then it's common in other places. So I try to warn you about it, but yeah, it just depends. So title insurance, like I said, doesn't cover the structure, doesn't cover the building, doesn't cover any of that. It is just your concept of ownership. Okay, just a concept of ownership that it's covering. And so, as I said, maybe, 27 years ago, they missed that there was 8 grantors conveying the property by way of an estate sale, and one of them didn't sign. Well, when you go to sell it and that's discovered, that's a title defect. Your title insurance is going to cover that. Now they're going to have to go find that person who didn't sign, and they're going to basically strong arm them into signing away their ownership in some way, shape, or form. They will typically bribe them with some money, say, listen, you could go to court and you could try to fight this, and you're going to get, maybe $400 in court, but we'll give you $1,000 right now to sign this quitclaim deed and just move on with your life, or something like that. So. One other interesting title insurance note, and I kind of mentioned this, but hopefully you'll be able to kind of tie it together a little bit better now. When we were talking about legal descriptions, those legal descriptions were considered adequate if a surveyor could go out and find them. And a survey is when a licensed surveyor can go out and they would do, use these different methodologies and identify your property lines. So a survey is used to discover quite a few things: encroachments, easements, access to public right-of-way, floodplains. A lot of different things can be discovered by a survey. Well, interesting note that if you elect not to get a survey, and that survey would have identified a title defect, then your title insurance is not going to cover that title defect because you elected to not have the survey.
So, Seth, when I was asking you about where I bought my property, and we found out that our house was actually on two different parts, we found it by having it surveyed. So that's what insured us to be able to get our title insurance, correct? Because we had it surveyed.
Well, the good news for you is you own both parcels. So while there is this unique thing that you discovered by way of a survey, it's not really a title defect so much because you own both. You hold title to both, right?
Yeah, but I had to buy the land from two different people. So the person that owned it before me had a title defect because he didn't own both parts.
Oh, so you didn't buy it that way. You just ended up purchasing the second parcel because you found out that it was encroaching on it?
I actually bought a total of 15 acres, but I bought it from 3 different people.
Oh. Yeah. The short answer is adult diapers. It depends. You don't have to talk to your attorney and your title insurance provider to see if that's something, because what typically happens when you discover those things and they're an issue, you would force the seller to remedy them and their title insurance would have to fix it. But since you bought all of them and technically it was not an issue for you, it probably wasn't remedied. And so it's not something that you can go through your title insurance for. You're probably just going to have to go out of pocket and just redraw your plat maps. But I couldn't guarantee that that's the case. That's why I said depends. I want to call your title insurance company.
We redid the map to include the house all on one plot.
You already did? Well, then you're good.
So if we decided to sell, it would all be together.
Yeah, there you go. Then you're good. Isn't real estate fun? Yeah. Sometimes it's just call your attorney. I don't know. This is just generalized things, right? I'm not going to beat this into the ground. We're going to talk about this more later, but I've already said this. The Connor Act says certain things need to be recorded. Okay, statute of fraud says certain things need to be in writing. Connor Act says certain things need to be recorded. The lists are basically identical, but the writing is to be able to take it to Judge Judy in a court of law. The Connor Act is to protect against third-party interests. And I'm going to give you different examples of this as we get into the contract section, okay? But we've already talked about these loosely. I've already mentioned this next slide too. I'm trying to get to some other things before we wrap up the night, folks. And I think maybe I've added a couple slides, so I'll print out another PDF of these and share them with you because I rearranged them after that syllabus came out and added a few things, but nothing too crazy. We will touch on everything in some way, shape, or form. It's just sometimes nice to have the visual, I know. So I told you sometimes recordation can be done electronically, but you have to understand that the actual register of deeds is a physical place. So I'll give you one more real world example of this, folks. When I bought the property in Georgia, it was family land, you know, from somebody on my grandmother's, like I think her mother or grandmother owned it. And so, I mean, it was family land for a while, and my grandmother had only owned it for like 30 years or 60. I don't remember how long she owned it. But I had to actually go to the physical courthouse in the county in Georgia because they don't have electronic records like we do in some of the municipalities in North Carolina. So I had to actually walk into a room and open these giant books. And when you saw the one deed, it would reference back to the previous deed. So I'd have to go find that book that it was referencing. That's how an old school title search was done. You find the book that has the current deed and it references the previous book. And then you go find the previous book and you look at it. And then you go find the previous book. So old school title searches used to be looking at these books that are like 1.5 feet thick and like 2 feet big, right? They're huge books. So let me introduce another concept that goes hand in hand with this transfer of title. And it is a math concept, but it's not a hard one. When you convey real property from grantor to grantee, you pay something called excise tax. Now, yet again, here's where I will warn you. There are multiple types of taxes that we could be dealing with in this class. There is real property tax, also called ad valorem real property tax. There is excise tax. Okay. There is multiple types of insurances. There's a lot of different concepts that are very similar. So excise tax has two other names that you need to know. It is also called transfer tax or revenue stamps. Transfer tax or revenue stamps, okay? Excise tax. And so I want you to picture this. I told you, in order for a deed to be valid, it doesn't need to be recorded, but wouldn't you be stupid to not record it at the courthouse? So even back in the day, folks, most people were doing these conveyances at the courthouse if they could help it. So I want you to picture this. You're at the county courthouse and you're selling a piece of property. And so you draft up this deed and you record it. And as you're sitting there counting out money and handling it to the next person, right, that you're paying, right? Grantor to grantee, or more specifically grantee to grantor, would be the money conveyance. Basically what this equates to is every single time you pay somebody $500, hand the state $1. So I'm going to say that another way. You get charged $1 of excise tax for every $500 worth of purchase price. You get charged $1 of excise tax for every $500 worth of purchase price. Now, I've got to make another big, important thing here. You've got to be very careful with what you're calculating and what number to use. Because if I'm telling you to calculate excise tax, you're going to be using the purchase price. If I tell you you're going to be calculating real property tax, you're going to be using what?
It's appraised value.
The tax assessor's value. Be very careful because when we get into financial appraisals, they're a little bit differently. But yeah, the tax appraiser or the tax assessor's value, called that ad valorem or assessed value. Well, when we get into loan stuff like interest, we're going to be using the loan amount. So there's different math with different amounts. And so imagine how confusing this gets. If I was to give you a test question, I say, who have I not picked on tonight? Justin? If I was to say, Justin purchased a house for $500,000. It appraised at $425,000. He got a $400,000 loan. And how much was his excise tax? You would have to know that I just gave you 6 different numbers and you have to pick the number, the purchase price, to calculate this. If you pick the wrong one, you're going to get the question wrong. And this is where I will reiterate, isn't real estate fun?
So is this pretty much just sales tax?
Real estate sales tax, yes, but it goes directly to the state and it's not a percentage. So, but that's basically what it is. It's tax that's only, that's right.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay, right. So instead of just like the 7.2 or whatever,
yeah,
regular sales tax is just.
That's exactly right.
Okay, that makes sense.
So here's the deal, folks. Speaking of sense, here's one of the magic things with this, okay? So if you were to look at any number, let me just give you kind of a random thing here. Let me do purchase price of $325,000. Oop, actually I'll do $350 because I already started writing it. Purchase price of $350,000. You take your purchase price of $350,000 and you divide by 500 because that's all you're saying, right? How many times does 500 go into this? Because you owe us $1 every time. So that's the answer. $700. That's the excise tax. Take your purchase price, divide by 500. Here's the one thing that will eat you alive on this. I want you to think of it this way. The government ain't got no sense, and they don't want any. So if you ever have a number that includes change, they will not forgive it and they will not take it. So they say round up. So let me show you what I mean. If you had some arbitrary sales price, like $329,421, is that a very common sales price? No. But if we had it, you would take your sales price of $329,421 and divide by 500. So the excise tax would be $6.59 because they will not take that 84 cents and they will not forgive it. And it does not follow normal rounding rules, folks. If it's so much as 1 penny, give them an extra $1. It does not follow normal rounding rules. It's always, if there's any change, go to the next $1. And this is where I told you before, your questions will never come down to rounding because we'll tell you what to do on the test, except for this. This is the one time that rounding will eat you alive because I promise you 658.84 will be an answer choice on the test. You better not pick it. Now, if you look back once again at that example deed I showed you earlier, excise tax $0. What does that mean?
It means that they gave the house, they didn't sell it.
It was a gift. You only pay excise tax when you make money on it. If you gift it, no excise tax. What that also means is if you ever look at a deed, even though it doesn't have to state the amount of consideration, all you have to do is just take the excise tax and multiply it by 500 and you can figure out what it sold for. It's that simple. Because look, in that example that I just gave, right? What do we have? Like something crazy like 658 or something times 500, whatever it was.
659.
Yeah, there you go. 659 rounded. It tells you more or less what they paid for it. If you're wanting to be nosy and you look at a house and you see what the excise tax is, multiply it by 500 if you want to know what they paid for it. But you've got to be very careful because excise tax is a very specific type of tax. It is only paid when?
When
You sell a home.
When you sell real property. And real property taxes are paid how often?
Yearly.
Every year. You see the difference. Do not let this screw you up on the test. What you got, Sam?
Well, I guess my question is, if they figure out your excise tax is like $700, do you pay it all in one lump sum as soon as you sell the house, or do they kind of like say you have 5 years to sell it, for example?
No, it's paid at closing. So the seller is going to pay it as part of the closing. Now, folks, I'm actually going to go off on a tangent here because I think now's a really good time to introduce a concept because I don't want to introduce it later and then it screw you up. And so this is where I'm going to have to give you a mini lesson, okay? Mini as in M-I-N-I. Small lesson. There are many M-A-N-Y lessons throughout this class. But I'm going to give you a mini lesson on a topic, okay? Because Sam asked a really good question. When we're dealing with closing a real estate transaction, that is a whole section in this curriculum. We'll get there. But, of course, we've got the buyer buying a house or a piece of real estate. We got the seller selling it. So we got a lot of money exchanging hands. And so there's something we utilize called a settlement statement that shows all the monies as it's exchanging hands. And so I'm going to go ahead and introduce a piece of verbiage that is very important with understanding a settlement statement. We talk about every single dollar in a closing, a real estate transaction, as either a credit or a debit. Okay, as either a credit or a debit. So you need to know these terminologies. They're very testable. So let me help you out. Folks, when you swipe your credit card, better yet, let me circle around because it's typically easier to answer the first way. When you swipe your debit card, what happens to the money in your bank account?
Comes out immediately.
Goes away.
It goes away. So when I say debit, that means we are taking money from you. Okay, if I say debit, that means we're taking money from you. And so if you go out and you buy something and you swipe your credit card, what just happened?
You're borrowing money?
Somebody gave you money. Yes, you'll have to pay it back later, but American Express, MasterCard, Discover, somebody just gave you money that you'll have to pay back later. And that's exactly how a settlement statement works. Everything is either a debit, us taking money from you, or a credit, us giving money to you. So excise tax is transfer tax, and in North Carolina, it defaults to the seller paying it. And so we would refer to excise tax as a seller debit on a closing disclosure or a settlement statement. Now that distinction will make more sense later. But if you hear me say closing disclosure or settlement statement, for now, just consider them the same thing. It is just an itemized list of all costs associated with buying real property or selling it.
So this kind of isn't really like sales tax at all then. Actually, I just kind of caught it. It's not paid by the buyer, it's paid by the seller. So the seller has to pay the money, not the buyer. So it's not really like sales tax at all.
Well, it is triggered by a sale, so it is like it in that regard, but you're right. It's not triggered by, or it's not paid by the buyer. Now, understand, folks, remember what I told you in your first week. There is the default setting, and then we can basically do whatever we want in real estate. It is not uncommon for some sellers to negotiate in the contract that the buyer has to pay it. But if we're asking you for default, seller pays it. Once again, new construction is notorious for sneaking it in their contract that the buyer has to pay the excise tax. What you got, Adriana?
Well, I have a question. If, suppose the seller is putting his house for sale in September, and then in November he pays off the property tax for the next year, and then he sells the house in sometime mid-January, so he will have to pay the excise tax. So what happens with the property tax? Does it get refunded, or the new owner will pay the prorate amount? How does it work?
Okay. Because I'm already down a rabbit hole and a tangent, we will go this route for the rest of the class. Because I think it's important, and you know, now's a good time to introduce it. So first, let's just clarify that we're talking about two different taxes in your scenario: the excise tax and the real estate tax. Now, I'm going to take the excise tax out of it for a second. I'm going to pull up a whiteboard, folks, just so you can see a blank screen, because I want you to get confused on concepts. Give it a second to load here.
Because I'm just thinking that the seller paid the property tax, but then the buyer, when he's buying the house, he will also pay the property tax, right?
Hang tight. This is a very testable concept, okay? So, no, I don't want that. I want a blank canvas. Everybody see this blank screen on my, okay.
Yeah.
So I told you in North Carolina, when does your tax lien attach to your property?
January 1st.
January 1st. So when we are looking at a year that presumably starts, well, it doesn't presumably, it does, January 1st and runs through, I'm going to say December 30th, because remember I told you the default in this class is 360-day year, 30-day month. So we pretend without anything to the contrary that every month has 30 days and every year has 360. Of course, we have to do the math for both, which sucks, but the tax lien, and let's just put this year, 2024, okay? The tax lien is already said to be on all of us who own properties, real estate, okay? We all owe property taxes this year. But I told you it's not considered due and payable until when in North Carolina?
September 1st.
September 1st. So we don't actually consider your bill due until September 1st. And the reason that is because the rate can change every year. And so they don't actually set the rate till like July. And then they send out the tax bills in August. And so then they're due and payable September 1st. And so Adriana's right, folks. At some point throughout the year, there is an annual tax bill. And we've got to figure out what to do with it. This is called proration. Proration is a term for dividing a bill between the two parties. And the best way that I can give you a comparison here. Have you ever gone out to eat with a friend and you order food and drinks, they order food and drinks, and when the check comes, the server, there's a couple options, right? What if the server just brings you the total check for $7.25, right? We got a lot of margaritas and fajitas, okay? Folks, we drank them under the table. And so this bill comes out and they just bring one check. So Stephanie and I went out to dinner and I had like $500 worth of food and margaritas. And Stephanie had the other $225. Would it be fair for me to be like, Stephanie, you got this? Would that be fair?
No, and Stephanie probably would cuss you out.
Oh my God, I bet you would. I would too. So folks, understand if they brought one check, what if Stephanie had a card and I had cash? Wouldn't it be fair if Stephanie swiped her card for the $7.25 as long as I gave Stephanie $500 in cash plus cash for tip? Doesn't that make life fair? Hopefully the answer is yes, because I paid for mine, she paid for hers. Yes, she swiped her card, but I gave her the cash for it. Conversely, I could swipe my card for $7.25 and Stephanie could give me $2.25 plus tip. And it's still fair, right? Or, better yet, what if we both have cash? I could put $500 plus tip cash in the book. Stephanie could put $225 plus cash and tip in the book. And we can just pay our portions, and we're done. Taxes work the exact same way. Either somebody's paying the whole bill and we're reimbursing them, or it's the other person doing that, or we're both paying it separately. And it really depends on the year, or the time of year, should I say. So let me now equate that to a tax bill. Let's say that you have a $3,000 a year tax bill. And we're closing on March 10th. Well, folks, think about it. Who is going to be swiping their card? Who's going to be paying that $3,000 tax bill?
The buyer.
The buyer. Because once again, we don't keep tabs on the seller. On this day, the seller's gone. And now the buyer owns it, so the tax assessor is going to mail that tax bill to the buyer sometime after September 1. And it's going to be the full tax bill. So it's not fair for the buyer to have to pay all $3,000 because how much did the seller eat?
The seller had 3 months.
The seller...
2 months and 10 days.
So now we got to get really specific with the days, okay? So the seller had it for all of January, all of February, and 10 days in March. Now, once again, the default is the seller owns the day of closing. The seller owns the day of closing. So if we're doing a 30-day calendar thing and the 360-day calendar thing, that would be
70 days.
all of January, all of February, and then 10 days in March for 70 days. And so let me help you understand this now that you kind of know credits and debits. And folks, we're going to talk more about this later. So if you're not following with me, don't freak out. But I said $3,000 a year. Well, we're charging somebody daily amounts. We need to know how much the seller is responsible for. The way that we do that is we divide it by the number of days in our fictitious year to get this number. This number is called a per diem. How much somebody would be responsible for per day. So now that we know that, the seller ate or was responsible for 70 days times your 833 a day. And so you asked a really good question, Adriana. Well, how do we handle this? Well, they're not both paying it. We're closing on March 10th, so what we're going to do is we know the buyer is going to swipe their card later. So how we make that fair is we take $583.10 from the seller at closing and we give it to the buyer, because that makes life fair when they pay the whole bill. So this would be a seller debit, taking money from, of $583.10, and a buyer credit at closing for $583.10. We are robbing Peter to pay Paul. This is called a tax proration.
So all of this is calculated previously.
All of this is calculated leading up to closing and handled at closing.
Okay.
And so that way, whenever, let's say that the buyer's going to get this $583 at closing, well, the buyer pays the tax bill, let's just say in, October sometime. They're paying that full $3,000, but that's okay because they had already been given $583 at closing. And so it's like the Stephanie and me scenario. Somebody swiped their card, somebody paid them cash, life is fair. And so the next year, when the buyer owns it the whole year, they will pay the full $3,000, no splitsies, because it's their house the whole year. Now, of course, the thing that changes is the tax scenario. So in this example that I gave you, we closed on March 10th. Let me change it. I'm going to make it easy on you. I'm going to leave the per diem the same. I'm going to leave the tax bill the same. But if we were closing, for instance, November 20th, before we could even calculate anything here, I'd have to tell you some extra information. What information do you need to know before we could figure out what's about to happen?
Did the tax rate change on July 1st, for one thing?
Well, the tax rate, but believe it or not, we typically always base it off of the previous year.
Don't have to worry about that.
Yeah. Now, if we have it, we will base it off the current year. So that could come into effect. But there's another question we got to answer. Because
Have they already paid the tax?
there you go. It can be paid anytime between September 1 and January 5th of the following year. So there's a chance that it could have already been paid when we close on November 20th. And so we need to know, has it been paid or has it not yet been paid? So think about it. If I told you that it has already been paid for the year, what does that mean?
You owe them money.
We got to use the right terminology. You can't just say you and them.
So the
Then
buyer would, or the grantee would owe the grantor.
And you can use buyer and seller in this context. That's okay.
So the buyer would owe the seller 40 days worth of, so 40 times.
Oh, and let's hold off on the days because I'm going to show you how to calculate them because some people aren't doing that automatically. So, but you're right. Let's just start with that. The buyer has to reimburse the seller some money because the seller paid the full bill. Now it's the opposite, right? Somebody swiped their card, but they've swiped it for the full bill. So we got to figure out how much the buyer ate, how much they need to reimburse them. So I didn't change the per diem. Now I always like to do the path of least resistance. If we're doing the 30-day month, 360-day year, that means the buyer is responsible for all of December, which has 30 days. And then when you're looking at this, the easiest thing to do is to just take the days in the month, 30, minus the date of closing, 20, for 10 days. So the buyer is responsible for 10, because remember, the seller is responsible for up to and including the day of closing. The buyer would be responsible for everything else. So for a total of 40 days. So now this would be 40 days times $8.33 a day. And so how would this look on a settlement statement? It would be a buyer debit, taking money from the buyer, of $333.20, and a seller credit of $333.20. Now, in the last few moments we have, I'm going to see how smart you folks are. I'm going to change one thing, and don't say it out loud, but if you figure it out, put it in the chat. What if I just changed, instead of it being paid, to unpaid? Tell me in the chat, what do you think it might look like on the closing or the settlement statement? I'll say settlement statement to not confuse anybody. What might it look like? Don't say it out loud. Put it in the chat. Some of y'all are just like, nope, it's too late for this, Seth. I'm not asking too much at 9:32 at night. What does John Cena say? You can't see me. I'm not here. I'm pretending. Kirsten, that's a hard rule. No math after 7 p.m. Okay, that's something I promised myself when I started driving a car. All right, nobody's gonna make me do math after 7 p.m. Think back to the scenario with Stephanie and I going out to eat. What was the last option we had? I gave you 3. There you go, Jacob. There it is. Both parties paid their part. Folks, it is after September. If it can be paid, it will be paid. I just told you that the buyer's portion was $333.20, so it would be a buyer debit of $333.20, and you just give everything else to the seller. Total bill is $3,000. Take out the buyer's portion of $333.20. So it would be a seller debit of $2,666.80 and a buyer debit of $333.20. This is what we call a double debit. You put your cash in the book, I put my cash in the book, and we just pay it. Who's actually paying it? The attorney. They will take this money at closing from both of us, and they will turn around and they will cut a check to the tax assessor. So it is paid for the year. Huzzah! You asked the question, Adriana. That was a good question. We were already on that little rabbit hole, so might as well teach you the prorations, right? Now, if you look in the math packet, there is a lot of examples on how to do this, because this is a big part of it. When we're dealing with prorations, dividing the bill between the parties, the most common things we're prorating: taxes, rent, and HOA dues. Now, we'll practice this and we'll talk more about this later, but now you have a basic understanding of these tax prorations. So there's 3 options. Take money from the seller, give it to the buyer. Take money from the buyer, give it to the seller. Take money from both, called a double debit. Pay it at closing. Excellent question.
I have a question.
What you got?
And you might have already done this, but I guess it just hit me right now that each month is 30 days. That's 360 days. So we're working on a 360-day year. So when we do math calculations to figure out a per day amount, will it always be divided by 360 and not 365?
Here's the thing where I have to tell you, unfortunately, we all live in an imperfect world. And I'll show you what I mean. If you look up, let's find Control F, tax prorations. If you look right here in the syllabus, 360-day year, 30-day month method used on pre-licensing course, end of course examination, and real estate license examinations. 365-year method, most commonly used method in practice. But here's the problem. I had a student several months ago who went and took the state licensing exam. And she came back to me, and she was not the only one. And she said, Seth, you told us that we were dealing with 360-day. I saw 365-day on the test. Now, fortunately, I taught my class how to do both because I just didn't really trust anybody. And so I reached out to the real estate commission. And I said, listen, I just had 3 or 4, because it was like 3 or 4 students, because I went into the group meet chat for that class, and I said, hey, just a heads up, students said they saw this. I'm going to reach out to the commission. And then a couple other students chimed in, and they said, yeah, I saw it too. So after I went to them, they said, oops, our mistake. They are testing you on both. And for, folks, years, they've been telling us they have not been testing on the 365-day year. Thank God one student actually came to me and said, I saw it that way. Because most people are just excited that they passed. So the default is 360-day year, 30-day month. But you could see it on the test that says, do this one to a real calendar 365-day year. And at that point, the methodology is the same, but instead of counting 30, 30, 30, you'd say January would be 31, February would be 28, March would be 31, so on and so forth. But the process is the exact same. It's just counting of the days is different. And then when you're trying to find the per diem, you would divide by 365 versus 360. And we'll kind of practice some more.
I know it's getting in the class, but I just have a quick question. So like this year being leap year, and you say
don't ever use leap year on the test.
So don't ever worry about it.
No. And listen, as an instructor, I have been dreading this year for years because I knew that it was going to screw all my students up, because if they ever had a test question with actual calendar days, they're going to throw it off. But you will never be tested like it's a leap year. Unfortunately, it is in fact a leap year, but even on the 365-day, do 365, not 366, and February has 28, not 29. Excellent question. I'm so mad about this year. What you got, Kingsley?
So for a foreclosure, who pays the taxes?
Remember, if there's any unpaid taxes, those get paid first. Remember the tax liens. So it would really depend on the date, the time frame. When we get into the financing section, you'll realize that most people have an escrow account to pay their taxes. And so the bank's probably going to take what they need out of your escrow account to pay your portion of the taxes until they foreclose upon you. But that'll make more sense when we get to the financing section.